Long before it became known as the capital of an empire, Trebizond stood as one of the most important ports on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea. From the earliest periods of recorded history, the city occupied a remarkable strategic position where the sea met the rugged mountains of northeastern Anatolia. In antiquity, its territory stretched from the region of modern Surmena in the southeast toward Rizayon, today's Rize, in the east. Ancient writers often describe this landscape as a place enclosed by immense mountain ranges, emphasizing how dramatically nature shaped both the city and the lives of its inhabitants. Unlike many other Black Sea harbors, Trebizond owed its importance not only to its coastline, but also to what lay beyond it. Difficult mountain roads connected the port with the interior of Anatolia, Eastern Highlands, the South Caucasus, and eventually Persia. Although these routes were challenging, they created one of the region's most valuable commercial corridors. Goods arriving by ship could continue deep into Asia, while resources from inland territories flowed back toward the Black Sea for export. The coastline itself offered excellent natural anchorages where merchant vessels could safely dock despite the unpredictable waters of the Black Sea. Rich fishing grounds supported local communities, while the surrounding mountains concealed abundant mineral resources. Copper deposits, in particular, played a major role in the region's prosperity for centuries. The intensive exploitation of these mines encouraged the construction and maintenance of numerous ancient roads crossing the mountains, linking mining districts with the harbor below. The origins of Greek settlement around the Black Sea remain one of the most debated subjects in ancient history. Historians have long struggled to determine exactly when Greek sailors first established permanent communities along these distant shores. Much of the uncertainty stems from the limited surviving evidence. Archaeological discoveries generally suggest that Greek expansion into the Black Sea did not begin before around 700 BC, yet scholars continue to debate whether isolated expeditions may have occurred earlier. New excavations may eventually provide clearer answers, but for now, the question remains open. What is certain is that by the late 7th century BC, Greek settlers had established numerous colonies around the Black Sea, driven by both commercial ambitions and the search for new land. Some settlements functioned primarily as trading posts, while others developed into permanent communities. Trebizond rapidly emerged as one of the most valuable ports in this expanding network because it provided access to the mineral-rich interior. Merchants traveling through the city could reach regions such as modern Gümüşhane, whose silver deposits ranked among the richest in Anatolia. Despite its later significance, surprisingly little is known about Trebizond before the age of Greek colonization. The earliest history of the city remains shrouded in uncertainty, largely because systematic archaeological excavations have yet to uncover definitive evidence of its first settlement. As a result, historians must rely heavily on ancient literary traditions, many of which disagree with one another. One of the principal ancient sources, the 4th century historian Eusebius, claimed that Trebizond had been founded approximately 125 years before Sinope. According to this tradition, Trebizond was established around 756 BC, while Sinope appeared roughly a century later. Since Sinope itself is generally regarded as a colony founded by Miletus, this chronology would make Trebizond one of the earliest Greek settlements in the entire Black Sea region. Not all historians accept these dates, however. Many modern scholars argue that such an early foundation is difficult to reconcile with current archaeological evidence. Most agree that Milesian colonization of the Black Sea accelerated only during the late 8th and early 7th centuries BC. Until extensive excavations are conducted beneath modern Trebizond, the precise date of the city's foundation and the identity of its earliest settlers will remain subjects of scholarly debate rather than established historical fact. Adding to the mystery, archaeological surveys carried out across northeastern Anatolia during the mid-20th century failed to uncover convincing traces of prehistoric occupation within Trebizond itself. While this absence of evidence does not necessarily prove that earlier communities never existed, it highlights how much of the city's earliest history still lies hidden beneath later layers of settlement. Long before Greek merchants arrived, the wider region had already witnessed the movement of powerful peoples across Eurasia. During the 9th century BC, pressure from the Scythians forced branches of the Cimmerians southward. These migrating groups eventually spread along the southern Black Sea coast, occupying territories that stretched from Heraclea Pontica in the west through Sinope and as far east as Trabzon. Their arrival transformed the political landscape of northern Anatolia and interrupted early Greek exploratory voyages into the region. Most historians now agree that the eastern Black Sea coast was inhabited well before the appearance of Greek colonies. Among the earliest peoples known by name were the Kaskians, who occupied parts of northeastern Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age. In the centuries that followed, waves of newcomers reshaped the region. From the 8th century BC onward, first the Cimmerians and later the Scythians established their influence across much of the Black Sea frontier. Archaeological discoveries and linguistic evidence alike confirmed that these nomadic cultures left a lasting imprint on the region long before classical Greek civilization became firmly established along its shores. Around 400 BC, the Greek soldier and historian Xenophon led the famous 10,000 on their long and desperate march back to Greece. During this extraordinary journey, he reached Trabzon and described it as a prosperous Greek colony established by the people of Sinope within the land of Colchis. His account provides one of the earliest detailed descriptions of the city and confirms that Trabzon had already become an important maritime settlement by the classical period. The city's success was no accident. Geography had made Trabzon the natural gateway between the Black Sea and the interior of Asia Minor. The valley of the Deir Mendera, lying just east of the city, offered one of the easiest routes from the Choru River basin to the coast. For traders, soldiers, and travelers crossing the rugged mountains of northeastern Anatolia, this passage represented the most practical connection with the sea. As a result, caravans arriving from inland regions naturally converged on Trabzon's harbor. Mountain ranges have always dictated the routes of communication in this part of Anatolia, and the ancient road network was no exception. The principal land route linking Trabzon with the interior followed the Choru Valley before crossing the formidable Zagana Pass. Xenophon himself marched along this difficult corridor, climbing through the mountains before finally descending toward the Black Sea. According to his own account, the moment his exhausted soldiers first caught sight of the sea became one of the most emotional scenes of the entire expedition. This strategic position transformed Trabzon into far more than a regional port. It became the maritime outlet for an enormous hinterland stretching across eastern Anatolia, the South Caucasus, and the Iranian Plateau. Trade routes carrying metals, textiles, agricultural products, and luxury goods all converged here before continuing by sea toward the Mediterranean world. Iron and copper extracted from the mining districts of Transcaucasia and northeastern Anatolia were among the many valuable commodities exported through its harbor. A major political transformation unfolded during the early 3rd century BC with the rise of the Kingdom of Pontus. Founded by Mithridates I, a ruler of Persian ancestry, the kingdom first established itself around Kimyata near the Ilgaz Mountains before expanding across northern Anatolia. Controlling the fertile valleys between the Kızılırmak and Yeşilırmak rivers, the kingdom steadily increased its influence. Under the ambitious reign of Mithridates, the 6th Eupator, Pontus reached the height of its power, extending eastward and incorporating the Black Sea coastline, including Trabzon, into its growing realm. The very name Pontos, later associated with both the kingdom and the Black Sea, has a long and fascinating history. Ancient Greek writers frequently used the word simply to mean the sea, although over time it became specifically linked with the Black Sea itself. Many scholars believe the term was adopted from an older local language rather than originating in Greek. Whatever its linguistic roots, the name eventually became inseparable from the northern coast of Anatolia and the civilization that flourished there. The wider region extending from modern Samsun to Artvin, together with the interior around Gümüşhane and Bayburt, had been inhabited since prehistoric times. Archaeological discoveries reveal continuous human activity across much of northeastern Anatolia, although evidence remains uneven from one area to another. As historical periods progressed, settlements became increasingly numerous, and communities gradually expanded from major centers into surrounding rural landscapes. Centuries before the rise of Pontus, dramatic migrations had already reshaped the political map of the region. Pressured by advancing Scythian tribes, the Cimmerians moved southward from the Caucasus during the late 8th century BC. Around 695 BC, they overran the Phrygian kingdom in central Anatolia and established themselves across large areas of the peninsula while preserving their nomadic steppe traditions. Some Cimmerian groups later spread northward along the Black Sea coast, extending their influence from Heraclea Pontica in the west to Trabzon in the east. For nearly a century, they dominated much of this coastal zone before renewed Scythian pressure forced them to migrate once again toward the northern shores of the Black Sea. The Scythians themselves soon emerged as another major force in the region. By the 7th century BC, they had established settlements east of the Kura River, and over the following centuries, their sphere of influence gradually expanded westward. Around the beginning of the 4th century BC, Scythian authority reached the Choru Valley, while several tribes controlled sections of the coastline between Sinope and Trabzon. Their presence demonstrates that long before the arrival of powerful empires, northeastern Anatolia had become a meeting ground where nomadic peoples, settled communities, and maritime traders interacted across vast distances. Some later historical traditions even suggest that when Alexander the Great's armies approached the Choru region during the 4th century BC, Turkic-speaking groups associated with the Kipchaks occupied territories extending westward from the Caspian Sea. Although these claims remain controversial among modern historians, they reflect the remarkable ethnic diversity that later writers associated with the Caucasus and northeastern Anatolia. Over the centuries, many of these early peoples gradually disappeared as distinct communities, merging with populations that settled the region afterward. Beginning in the late 7th century BC, Greek colonies multiplied along the Black Sea coast, introducing new commercial networks and urban traditions. Following Alexander's death, the Persian-descended Mithridatic dynasty consolidated control over much of the coastline from Sinope to Trabzon. After the collapse of the Kingdom of Pontus, Roman authority replaced it, followed centuries later by Byzantine rule, which remained dominant until the arrival of the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century. Although the Seljuks fundamentally altered the political balance of Anatolia, the eastern Black Sea coast initially remained beyond the first wave of Turkish conquests. Another early Turkic community associated with the region appears during the Byzantine period. After prolonged conflicts in the Balkans, the empire resettled groups of Bulgars along the Choru Valley and around Trabzon during the 6th century. This policy strengthened frontier defenses while adding yet another cultural layer to an already diverse landscape. Between the 7th and 9th centuries AD, commercial activity along the Black Sea experienced a remarkable revival. Ports scattered across the northern Anatolian coastline became increasingly interconnected through maritime trade. Ships regularly sailed between Constantinople, Cherson in Crimea, and Heraclea Pontica, transporting grain, manufactured goods, and luxury products. Crimean wheat became especially important for feeding the Byzantine capital, while merchants carried a wide variety of regional products in both directions. Further east, Amastris emerged as one of the principal commercial centers of Paphlagonia. Contemporary Byzantine writers praised the city as the Eye of Paphlagonia, noting its thriving connections with peoples living along the northern shores of the Black Sea. Scythian merchants were already active there by the 9th century, exchanging agricultural produce and locally manufactured goods. Similar prosperity could be seen in other ports such as Sinope, whose strategic harbor served both commerce and the Byzantine fleet, and Amisus, which maintained close trading links with Crimea. Cities including Ceresus also developed thriving textile industries whose products eventually supplied the markets of Constantinople. Yet among all these Black Sea ports, Trabzon stood above the rest. By the Middle Byzantine period, it had become the wealthiest, most populous, and commercially significant city in the eastern Black Sea. Positioned near the productive grain districts of Bayburt and Chaldea, it functioned as both a frontier fortress and an international marketplace. Merchants arriving from Arabia, Armenia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Syria met Byzantine traders here to exchange goods before they continued toward Constantinople by sea. Arab geographers of the 10th century consistently described Trabzon as one of the richest cities in the region. Grain harvested across northeastern Anatolia was gathered, stored, and redistributed through its warehouses, while ships arriving from Crimea unloaded additional cargo destined for Byzantine markets. The city's strategic location connected overland caravan routes from the Caucasus and Inner Asia, with maritime routes leading directly to the imperial capital. Like several other major Byzantine cities, Trabzon also developed into a cosmopolitan commercial center where merchants from many different cultures lived side by side. Armenian and Arab traders established permanent communities, while Muslim merchants operated not only in Trabzon but also in cities such as Antalya, Kayseri, Malatya, Ankara, Nicaea, and numerous other commercial hubs across Anatolia. Their presence illustrates the vibrant international economy that continued to flourish despite the political and religious rivalries of the medieval world. During the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Basil I, Trabzon's growing importance was recognized with the establishment of a bishopric, strengthening its role not only as a commercial center, but also as a major religious destination. Pilgrims and merchants from across the Middle East traveled to the city, where many visited the shrine of Saint Eugenius, the city's patron saint. The bustling streets of Trabzon welcomed an extraordinary mixture of peoples: Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Georgians, Jews, and Rus merchants, making it one of the most cosmopolitan ports of the medieval Black Sea. Commerce fueled this prosperity. Local merchants built immense fortunes by acting as intermediaries between East and West, while caravans arriving from the Caucasus came in search of high-quality Byzantine textiles. By the 10th century, luxury fabrics woven in the Byzantine Empire reached Islamic markets through Trabzon's harbor. At the same time, the city became a distribution point for grain, perfumes, spices, medicinal plants, and countless other valuable products arriving from the east before continuing toward Constantinople and the wider Mediterranean. Medieval Arab geographers consistently describe Trabzon as one of the greatest commercial hubs of the region. According to their accounts, annual trading seasons attracted merchants representing a remarkable variety of cultures and religions. Temporary marketplaces filled with goods from every corner of the known world transformed the city into a vibrant center of exchange. Muslim traders conducted business alongside Byzantine, Armenian, Circassian, and Georgian merchants, creating an economy that extended far beyond the political frontiers of the empire. One contemporary writer even remarked that Trabzon served as the frontier city of the Greeks, noting that nearly every Muslim merchant traveling into Byzantine territory eventually passed through its markets. The finest Byzantine textiles, together with imported luxury silks, were transported eastward through this single gateway. Muslim trading communities established permanent residences in the city, purchasing linen garments and other manufactured goods arriving by sea before forwarding them to markets across the Islamic world. These exports became so highly regarded that Trabzon's reputation spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Modern historians also point out that the city's commercial life was even more diverse than medieval writers sometimes suggested. Armenian merchants maintained extensive trading networks through the port, while Muslim caravans regularly brought merchandise from inland Anatolia and neighboring regions. This continuous movement of people and goods transformed Trabzon into one of the wealthiest and most prosperous urban centers on the Black Sea. Not every coastal settlement enjoyed such prominence. Ports such as Ordu and Unye remained relatively modest during this period and only gained greater military significance in later centuries as naval bases. Nevertheless, Byzantine chronicles reveal that commerce flourished across the northern coast of Anatolia. Grain shipments arriving from the Black Sea were regarded as essential for supplying Constantinople, emphasizing the enormous strategic value of the region to the Byzantine state. The political balance of northeastern Anatolia began to change dramatically during the 11th century with the arrival of the Oghuz Turks. The first major reconnaissance expedition, led by Çağrı Bey in 1018, marked the beginning of a gradual transformation that would reshape both the ethnic composition and political landscape of the eastern Black Sea. These early expeditions were followed by increasingly frequent military campaigns that pushed deeper into Byzantine territory. After the Seljuk victory near Hasankale in 1048, forces commanded by Ibrahim Yinal launched raids into the hinterland surrounding Trabzon, bringing Turkish armies into the region for the first time. Only a few years later, troops loyal to Sultan Tugril expanded these operations, advancing from the Choru Valley toward the western Black Sea coast. Continuous pressure weakened Byzantine control, and by 1058 the strategically important fortress of Shebin-Karahisar had fallen into Seljuk hands. The expansion continued under Sultan Alp Arslan. His Georgian campaign of 1064 brought areas such as Shavshat and Artvin under Seljuk influence, further strengthening Turkish authority across northeastern Anatolia. Following the decisive Battle of Manzikert in 1071, Turkish settlement accelerated across much of Anatolia, and the eastern Black Sea hinterland was no exception. Vast rural districts came under the control of Turkmen groups, while important urban centers including Bayburt and even Trabzon briefly acknowledged Seljuk authority. Yet Byzantine control over Trabzon was not permanently broken. Around 1075, the capable military commander Theodoros Gabras, serving as the empire's governor in the region, recaptured the city with the support of influential local elites. His success went beyond recovering Trabzon itself. Byzantine forces also regained much of the coastline as far west as Sinope, while important inland fortresses such as Shebin-Karahisar were restored to imperial control. The restoration of Byzantine authority coincided with increasing instability in Constantinople. During the 12th century, fierce rivalry between the Komnenos and Angelos dynasties weakened central government and allowed powerful provincial families to expand their influence. Among the greatest beneficiaries were the Gabras family, whose enormous wealth and military strength made them the dominant force throughout Chaldea and Trabzon. Having secured the region after Manzikert, Theodoros Gabras effectively governed as an autonomous ruler while formally remaining loyal to the emperor. Seeking to preserve imperial influence, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos attempted to strengthen relations through diplomacy, arranging a marriage alliance between his own daughter Maria Komnena and Gregory Gabras, who was being held in Constantinople. Despite these efforts, the Gabras family maintained considerable independence. Even after Theodoros's death, attempts by the Byzantine government to replace the family with imperial officials quickly collapsed. The Gabras household continued to dominate Trabzon and Chaldea well into the middle of the 12th century. Emperor John II Komnenos later campaigned in the region, hoping to force Konstantinos Gabras back under direct imperial authority, but his efforts proved equally unsuccessful. The family's influence extended beyond Byzantium itself. Members of the Gabras dynasty maintained close ties with the Seljuk Sultanate, and several entered Seljuk service. One prominent figure even rose to the rank of emir, an extraordinary example of the fluid political loyalties that characterized medieval Anatolia. Byzantine historian John Kinnamos recounts that this Gabras fought alongside the Seljuk army against Byzantine forces and was killed in battle in 1146, illustrating how aristocratic families often crossed political and cultural boundaries during this turbulent era. Meanwhile, the Turkish principalities that emerged after Manzikert continued to reshape the balance of power across northeastern Anatolia. The Danish Mendids expanded northward from Niksar, eventually controlling much of the Yeşilırmak Basin and the lands reaching toward Samsun. Further east, the Saltukids established themselves around Erzurum, holding Bayburt while defending the frontier against repeated Georgian incursions. The Mengucek dynasty, ruling from Erzincan, controlled Shebin-Karahisar and frequently launched military expeditions toward Trabzon. Together, these frontier states ensured that the eastern Black Sea remained one of the most contested regions of medieval Anatolia, where Byzantine governors, Turkish rulers, Caucasian kingdoms, and ambitious local dynasties constantly competed for influence. The Empire of Trebizond emerged in the political chaos created by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople fell to the Latin Crusaders. Before that dramatic event, the region around Trabzon was already largely governed by powerful local elites rather than by direct Byzantine authority. Seizing this opportunity, the brothers Alexios and David Komnenos, members of the deposed Komnenian imperial family, entered Trabzon with military support from Queen Tamar of Georgia and established a new Byzantine successor state that would survive until its conquest by the Ottomans in 1461. The survival of this new empire depended on far more than military strength. Unlike Constantinople, Trebizond ruled a relatively compact Greek-speaking population whose identity was reinforced by monasteries, rural communities, and the fertile valleys, stretching inland from the Black Sea coast. At the same time, the Komnenian rulers developed pragmatic relations with the Turkish principalities of Anatolia. Political marriages, diplomatic alliances, and economic cooperation with neighboring Turkish powers became central to the empire's remarkable longevity. The close relationship between the Komnenian dynasty and the Georgian royal family had deep historical roots. Long before the empire was founded, Byzantine and Georgian rulers had strengthened their ties through generations of dynastic marriages. After the overthrow of Emperor Andronikos, the first Komnenos, the surviving heirs of the dynasty found refuge under Queen Tamar. When the Byzantine emperor confiscated property belonging to Georgian monasteries and the Komnenian family had already suffered persecution at the hands of the Angelos dynasty, Tamar saw both political and personal reasons to intervene. She provided Alexios and David with troops, enabling them to capture Trabzon and establish an independent state. From its very beginning, however, the Empire of Trebizond faced fierce competition from other Byzantine successor states. Both the rulers of Trebizond and the Empire of Nicaea claimed to be the legitimate heirs of Byzantium. Because the Komnenoi belonged to one of Byzantium's most prestigious imperial families, they considered their own claim superior to that of Theodore Lascaris in Nicaea. David Komnenos launched ambitious campaigns across Paphlagonia in an effort to expand westward and ultimately recover Constantinople. These advances were halted when Theodore Lascaris defeated his forces, preventing Trebizond from extending its influence beyond northwestern Anatolia. As a result, the empire gradually abandoned its dream of restoring the Byzantine Empire and instead concentrated on preserving its independence along the eastern Black Sea coast. The newly founded Empire of Trebizond quickly found itself caught in a three-way struggle for power with the Empire of Nicaea and the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Although David Komnenos succeeded in extending his authority westward as far as Heraclea Pontica, his expansion alarmed Theodore Lascaris of Nicaea, who eventually halted his advance. Unable to defeat David alone, Lascaris forged an alliance with the Seljuks, creating a political balance that prevented Trebizond from dominating northern Anatolia. David died in 1212, and with his death, the empire abandoned its most ambitious plans for westward expansion. Even though the rulers of Trebizond continued to present themselves as the legitimate heirs of the Komnenian dynasty and the true successors of the Byzantine emperors, they remained politically isolated from Constantinople while successfully preserving their independence for more than 2.5 centuries. Relations between the Empire of Trebizond and the Seljuk Sultanate were shaped by both conflict and cooperation. While military campaigns frequently erupted over strategic territory, long periods of peaceful coexistence also existed, during which Greeks and Turks traded, interacted, and in many areas lived alongside one another. The rivalry centered on control of the Black Sea coast, where commercially valuable ports such as Trabzon and Sinope became the principal objectives of Seljuk expansion. After the weakening of Byzantine power following the Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176, the Seljuks steadily increased their influence across Anatolia, while the political fragmentation caused by the Fourth Crusade created new opportunities for regional powers to compete for the northern coastline. The first major confrontation came when Alexios Komnenos launched operations against Seljuk-controlled territories around Samsun and neighboring Black Sea ports. These campaigns threatened the commercial network linking the Seljuk interior with international markets. In response, Sultan Kaikhusra I besieged Trabzon in an effort to restore control over the trade routes. Contemporary chroniclers describe how merchants from Syria, Mesopotamia, and other eastern regions became stranded around Sivas because the roads leading to the Black Sea had been cut off. Commerce slowed dramatically, goods accumulated in inland markets, and traders suffered heavy financial losses. These accounts demonstrate that the struggle between Trebizond and the Seljuks was driven not only by territorial ambitions, but also by the desire to dominate one of the most profitable commercial corridors connecting the Black Sea, Anatolia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Faced with the growing ambitions of David Komnenos, the Seljuks and the Empire of Nicaea temporarily set aside their differences and cooperated to contain Trebizond's expansion, establishing a balance of power that would shape the politics of northern Anatolia for decades to come. The first military confrontations between the Seljuk Sultanate and the Empire of Trebizond were driven as much by commerce as by territorial ambition. At the beginning of the 13th century, Trebizond stood at the center of one of the busiest trade networks linking the Black Sea, Anatolia, and the Middle East. Cargo arriving from the northern Black Sea, particularly from the Russian steppes, was unloaded at Trabzon before continuing overland to Sivas, and from there to the great commercial cities of Anatolia and Syria. Contemporary travelers consistently described Sivas as one of the wealthiest frontier cities of the period, a prosperity made possible by its close connection with the bustling port of Trabzon. The routes carried an astonishing variety of goods, including luxurious Byzantine textiles, valuable furs, and even slaves. As long as this commercial artery remained open, both the coastal ports and the inland markets flourished. This economic importance explains why the interruption of trade quickly became a political crisis. When access to Trabzon was disrupted, merchants found themselves unable to move goods between the Black Sea and central Anatolia, causing serious financial losses throughout the region. The Seljuk rulers therefore had compelling economic reasons to secure these trade routes, although religious and political rivalry certainly influenced relations between the two states, the struggle for control of commerce became one of the defining features of their rivalry. Even the earliest campaigns against Trabzon appear to have been motivated as much by the desire to reopen profitable trade as by the ambition to conquer territory. A second and far more decisive conflict erupted in 1214, this time centered on the strategically vital port of Sinope. Control of Sinope meant control of the maritime connection between Trabzon and the Byzantine world. By capturing the city, the Seljuks could isolate Trebizond from its western allies while strengthening their own influence over Black Sea commerce. The campaign unfolded alongside broader struggles involving the Seljuks, the Empire of Nicaea, and rival claimants to the Seljuk throne, making the conflict part of a much larger contest for power across Anatolia. Internal divisions within the Seljuk dynasty also shaped these events. Following the death of Sultan Kaikhosro I, a bitter succession struggle developed between his sons, Iz al-Din Kaikous and Ala al-Din Kaikubad. Regional rulers, Armenian allies, and influential frontier lords all chose sides in this conflict. Some modern historians believe that Emperor Alexios I of Trebizond attempted to exploit this instability by supporting Kaikubad's cause, hoping to weaken the Seljuk state while expanding Trebizond's influence along the northern frontier. Whether this support was direct or indirect remains uncertain, but the empire clearly sought to benefit whenever neighboring powers became distracted by civil conflict. After securing his throne, Sultan Iz al-Din Kaikous turned his attention northward. Reports soon reached his court claiming that Alexios had crossed the frontier and violated Seljuk territory. Determined to eliminate the threat, the Sultan organized a major expedition against Sinope. The operation required a carefully coordinated siege by both land and sea, since the city's formidable defenses could not easily be overcome from a single direction. During the campaign, fortune unexpectedly favored the Seljuks. While hunting with only a small escort near Sinope, Emperor Alexios was surprised by Seljuk frontier forces and taken prisoner. His capture dramatically altered the course of the siege. The Sultan ordered the emperor to send a message urging the defenders to surrender, but the city's leaders initially refused. They declared that even if Alexios remained a captive, another member of the imperial family could continue the dynasty, and they would never willingly hand the city over to the Seljuks. As the siege tightened, resistance gradually weakened. The Seljuks destroyed the Greek fleet anchored in the harbor, completely cutting Sinope off from outside assistance. At the same time, psychological pressure mounted as the imprisoned emperor was publicly threatened before the city's defenders. Eventually, the garrison agreed to surrender after receiving guarantees that Alexios' life would be spared and that the inhabitants would be allowed to leave safely with their families and possessions. On 1 November 1214, Sinope officially passed into Seljuk hands, marking one of the most important turning points in the history of the Black Sea. The fall of Sinope in late 1214 completely reshaped the balance of power along the Black Sea. Rather than destroying the Empire of Trebizond, however, the Seljuk victory ended with an unexpected political settlement. After negotiations between Sultan Izz al-Din Kaikous and the captured Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, a peace agreement was concluded that allowed the emperor to regain his freedom while recognizing the new political reality. According to the terms of the treaty, Alexios agreed to acknowledge Seljuk supremacy in exchange for the safety of both himself and his family. The Empire of Trebizond accepted the loss of Sinope and its surrounding fortresses, while also promising an annual tribute consisting of gold, horses, cattle, sheep, and valuable luxury gifts. Even more significantly, the emperor pledged military assistance whenever the Seljuk Sultan requested it. The agreement effectively transformed Trebizond from an independent regional challenger into a tributary state that was expected to cooperate with the Seljuk court. Once the negotiations were completed, Alexios and his entourage were released and allowed to sail eastward towards Samsun before returning to Trabzon. The settlement did not end the struggle for northern Anatolia. Only weeks after his release, Alexios attempted to recover influence across Paphlagonia, hoping to regain at least part of the territory his empire had recently lost. His ambitions, however, collided with those of Theodore Lascaris, ruler of the Empire of Nicaea. Taking advantage of Trebizond's weakened position, Lascaris launched another campaign into the region. Contemporary Byzantine writers describe almost no organized resistance to the advance. Important strongholds, including Heraclea Pontica, surrendered without prolonged fighting, allowing Nicaea to secure much of western Paphlagonia with surprisingly little bloodshed. By the end of 1214, a new frontier had emerged. The Seljuks controlled Sinop and much of the central Black Sea coast, while Nicaea absorbed large sections of Paphlagonia, leaving Trebizond confined to the eastern coastline. Despite these setbacks, the military performance of Trebizond during its first decade should not be underestimated. Between 1205 and 1214, the young empire had successfully resisted repeated offensives from both the Seljuks and the Empire of Nicaea. David Komnenos may have failed in his dream of advancing toward Constantinople, but the empire demonstrated that it possessed capable armies, experienced commanders, and sufficient logistical resources to defend two distant frontiers simultaneously. What ultimately undermined Trebizond was not military weakness alone, but the overwhelming strategic pressure created by fighting multiple enemies at the same time. Several factors explain why the empire, nevertheless, lost nearly half of its territory within only a few years of its foundation. One important reason was the personal misjudgment of Emperor Alexios. His capture while hunting near Sinope deprived the empire of its leader at the worst possible moment and dealt a severe blow to morale. Another factor was the uncertain loyalty of the local population in Paphlagonia. The earlier removal of David Komnenos, who had once governed the region, may have weakened popular support for Alexios and reduced local resistance when Nicaean armies advanced. Perhaps the greatest challenge, however, came from diplomacy rather than the battlefield. Instead of competing with one another, the Seljuk Sultanate and the Empire of Nicaea temporarily aligned their interests against Trebizond. Their campaigns unfolded almost simultaneously, suggesting careful coordination between the two governments. Such cooperation prevented the Komnenian rulers from concentrating their forces against a single opponent. While the Seljuks attacked from the east and seized Sinope, Nicaea advanced from the west into Paphlagonia, placing the Empire of Trebizond under relentless pressure from both directions. This alliance was no coincidence. Only a few years earlier, relations between the Seljuks and Nicaea had been hostile, culminating in the death of Sultan Khusro I during the Battle of Antioch on the Meander in 1211. After Izz al-Din Kaikous ascended the Seljuk throne, however, both governments quickly recognized that cooperation served their interests better than continued conflict. Theodore Lascaris restored diplomatic relations by sending valuable gifts to Konya and even contributed funds in memory of the late Sultan. With peace established between the two powers, both rulers were free to focus their attention on the rapidly expanding Empire of Trebizond, which had become the most immediate strategic threat along the Black Sea frontier. Their coordinated policy decisively shifted the balance of power in northern Anatolia and marked the end of Trebizond's brief period of territorial expansion. The capture of Sinope in 1214 marked far more than the loss of a single fortress. It fundamentally altered the political future of Anatolia and reshaped the balance of power along the Black Sea. Although historians often describe the campaign in Paphlagonia as a relatively bloodless conflict, its long-term consequences rivaled those of the Battle of Manzikert. For centuries, Sinope had served as the strategic bridge linking the Byzantine world with the eastern Black Sea. Once the city passed into Seljuk hands, that bridge was broken. The importance of the conquest lay not simply in which state controlled Sinope, but in the fact that the city permanently slipped out of Byzantine influence. At almost the same time, Paphlagonia fell under the authority of the Empire of Nicaea, creating a political barrier between Western Byzantine territories and the Empire of Trebizond. As a result, the Komnenian rulers lost any realistic opportunity of marching westward to reclaim Constantinople. Their dream of restoring the Byzantine Empire effectively came to an end, while Trebizond found itself isolated on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. The consequences extended well beyond Trebizond itself. For the first time in Byzantine history, the empire's remaining lands in Anatolia were permanently divided into separate regions with no secure connection between them. Across much of western and central Anatolia, nomadic Turkmen tribes steadily expanded their presence, gradually transforming the political and demographic landscape. From this point onward, Byzantine communities increasingly found themselves living under Turkish rule, while Trebizond became a distant frontier state separated from its former allies by geography as much as by politics. For the Seljuks, the victory represented the culmination of a broader strategic vision. Throughout the 12th century, they had dominated the Anatolian interior but lacked direct access to major seaports. Without secure ports on either the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, international commerce remained vulnerable to Byzantine interference. Merchant complaints, pirate attacks, and repeated disruptions to trade convinced the Seljuk sultans that controlling the coastline was essential if they hoped to build a stable and prosperous state. The first major breakthrough came in 1207 with the conquest of Antalya, giving the Seljuks their long-awaited outlet to the Mediterranean. Their expansion continued during the following years as they secured additional coastal territory and strengthened maritime trade. Yet the conquest of Sinope proved even more significant. Possession of the city's harbor gave the Seljuks direct access to the Black Sea, connected them with northern trade routes, and opened the strategic road leading through Paphlagonia toward northwestern Anatolia. The disappearance of this important Byzantine defensive position also accelerated Turkish expansion toward Bithynia, laying foundations that would later benefit the emerging Ottoman frontier. Ironically, the greatest beneficiaries of these events were neither Trebizond nor the Empire of Nicaea, but the Seljuks themselves. After the collapse of Byzantine authority in 1204, the two Byzantine successor states competed fiercely for the imperial legacy instead of cooperating against their common rival. Their rivalry weakened both governments, allowing the Seljuks to exploit the situation with remarkable success. Theodore Lascaris' temporary alliance with the Seljuk Sultan helped eliminate Trebizond as a serious challenger, but in the broader perspective, it also accelerated the fragmentation of Byzantine power throughout Anatolia. From 1214 onward, the Empire of Trebizond ceased to be an expanding power and instead survived as a small, regional kingdom whose territory was largely confined to the old province of Chaldea. The Komnenian rulers, however, refused to accept this new order. The humiliating treaty imposed after the loss of Sinope did not end their ambitions, and throughout the following decade, they searched for opportunities to restore their independence. Emperor Andronikos Gidos, who came to the throne after Alexios, appears to have sought alliances that might counterbalance Seljuk power, but these diplomatic efforts achieved only limited success. Greek chronicles record that sometime during the early 1220s, a Seljuk prince, referred to simply as the Melik, launched a major expedition against Trabzon. Although several Byzantine authors describe the campaign, they disagree on its exact date and even on the identity of the Seljuk commander. Some place the events around 1222 or 1223, while others connect them with later developments under Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad. Because the surviving narratives were written decades after the campaign and combine historical events with religious traditions surrounding Saint Eugenius, modern historians continue to debate the chronology. Even so, these accounts leave little doubt that the struggle between the Seljuks and Trebizond continued well after the Peace of 1214, and remained one of the defining conflicts of the eastern Black Sea during the 13th century. Relations between the Empire of Trebizond and the Seljuk Sultanate did not remain peaceful for long after the Treaty of 1214. According to later Byzantine tradition, tensions began to rise when Greek forces launched retaliatory raids against territories around Gerza and even reached the outskirts of Sinope, plundering settlements and capturing or killing Turkish sailors anchored in the harbor. Faced with these unexpected attacks, the Seljuk governor of Sinope opened negotiations with the Trapezontines. The discussions eventually resulted in the return of several imperial ships that had previously been seized near Crimea, together with their crews. Although these events survive primarily in later narratives, they suggest that diplomacy and military action often unfolded side by side along the Black Sea frontier. The most dramatic episode preserved in the Byzantine tradition concerns a large Seljuk expedition against Trabzon itself. Medieval writers attributed the city's survival to the miraculous intervention of Saint Eugenius, the patron saint of Trabzon. According to the story, the invading Seljuk army was decisively defeated, its commander, the mysterious Melik, was taken prisoner, and a new peace agreement followed. Under the terms described in the narrative, Trebizond was released from its earlier obligations to provide tribute and military service to the Seljuk Sultan, while the captured commander was eventually escorted safely back through Sinope on his return to Konya. Although the religious elements clearly belong to hagiographic tradition, the story reflects the determination of the people of Trabzon to portray their city as divinely protected during one of its greatest crises. Modern historians, however, approach these accounts with caution. The principal source, written by Ioannes Lazaropoulos, combines historical events with religious storytelling and frequently departs from a reliable chronological sequence. Some episodes appear to ignore political realities, while others merge incidents that probably occurred years apart. For this reason, scholars have compared Lazaropoulos' narrative with Arabic, Persian, and Byzantine chronicles in an attempt to reconstruct what actually happened. Rather than treating the text as a straightforward historical record, researchers now regard it as a mixture of genuine events, local memory, and legendary tradition. One Arabic chronicle records that around 1225 to 1226, Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad defeated a Byzantine ruler identified as Kir Alexios and captured several of his strongholds. The identity of this Alexios remains uncertain, and many historians believe the chronicler confused different individuals or misunderstood the events entirely. Other contemporary sources offer little support for this version of the story, making it impossible to reconstruct the campaign with complete certainty. The contradictions between the Greek and Islamic accounts remain one of the most difficult problems in the history of 13th century Trebizond. Despite these uncertainties, one broad conclusion is widely accepted. During the early reign of Ala al-Din Kaikubad, the struggle for control of the Black Sea intensified dramatically. Trade routes linking Crimea, Sinope, and Trabzon became increasingly valuable, and competition over customs revenues and maritime commerce often triggered military confrontations. The surviving evidence suggests that ships transporting taxes, merchants, and wealthy officials became frequent targets as both powers sought to dominate the northern trade network. Two independent medieval sources provide an intriguing clue about these conflicts. Byzantine chronicler Michael Panaretos reports that a Seljuk attack on Trabzon took place in 1223, while the Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir records that, during roughly the same period, a richly laden vessel carrying refugees and valuable cargo was wrecked along the Black Sea coast before its contents were seized by the Seljuks. Although the two authors describe different events, many historians believe they may reflect separate perspectives on the same broader crisis. If so, the struggle between Trebizond and the Seljuks was driven not only by territorial ambitions, but also by fierce competition over maritime commerce, taxation, and the immense wealth flowing through the Black Sea. For the rulers of Trebizond, the loss of a ship carrying tax revenues from Crimea would have represented far more than an economic setback. Those revenues were essential to the empire's finances and helped sustain both its military and its government. A direct attack on such a convoy could easily have been interpreted as a violation of existing agreements and a declaration of hostility. This may explain why relations deteriorated so rapidly after years of uneasy coexistence. Whether the surviving accounts preserve every detail, accurately or not, they point to a larger historical reality. Throughout the early 13th century, control of Black Sea trade remained the central issue behind almost every confrontation between the Empire of Trebizond and the Seljuk Sultanate. Although the surviving sources do not reveal every detail of the events of 1223, they leave little doubt that another serious conflict erupted between the Seljuk Sultanate and the Empire of Trebizond. Byzantine chronicles agree that the Seljuk campaign ended unsuccessfully, but they also suggest that the immediate cause of the war lay not in territorial ambition alone. A maritime incident, most likely involving the seizure or destruction of an important vessel, appears to have triggered a crisis that quickly escalated into open warfare. Yet, this was only the spark. Beneath the surface lay a much broader struggle for dominance over Black Sea commerce and the lucrative trade routes that connected Anatolia with Crimea and the wider Eurasian world. By this time, Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad had begun pursuing an ambitious naval and commercial policy. After securing Sinope, the Seljuks looked across the Black Sea towards Sudak in Crimea, one of the region's richest trading ports. Their objective was clear. If they could control both shores of the sea, they could dominate the flow of goods between the Eurasian steppes, the Caucasus, and Anatolia. The expedition commanded by Husam al-Din Choban proved highly profitable. Enormous quantities of booty and commercial wealth were carried back to Seljuk territory, enriching cities such as Sinope and Kastamonu, while demonstrating the economic value of Black Sea expansion. The campaign did not end there. Although the Seljuks eventually lost their foothold in Sudak to the advancing Mongols, they did not abandon their broader strategy. Instead, they intensified attacks against vessels connected with the Empire of Trebizond, hoping to undermine the empire's influence over regional shipping. These maritime operations served a dual purpose. They weakened a major commercial rival while simultaneously compensating for the losses the Seljuks had suffered after withdrawing from Crimea. Seen from this perspective, the campaign against Trabzon was not an isolated military adventure, but the continuation of a carefully planned commercial strategy aimed at controlling Black Sea trade. Trade had become one of the central priorities of Seljuk state policy. During the early 13th century, the sultans invested enormous resources in securing caravan routes, protecting merchants, and eliminating threats to international commerce. Military expeditions against both the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia and the Empire of Trebizond reflected this wider objective. Rather than pursuing conquest for its own sake, the Seljuk government increasingly viewed economic security as the foundation of political power. Whoever controlled the trade routes controlled the wealth of Anatolia. At the same time, Eastern Anatolia had become the stage for a complex rivalry involving three major regional powers: the Seljuk Sultanate, the Ayyubid dynasty, and the Kingdom of Georgia. Although the Ayyubids were divided among several competing princes ruling cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Diyarbakir, they continued to cooperate whenever external threats emerged. Their rulers successfully prevented both Georgian expansion into Syria and complete Seljuk domination of eastern Anatolia. As Seljuk influence continued to grow, both the Ayyubids and the Georgian monarchy became increasingly active in regional politics, recognizing that the balance of power was rapidly shifting. The Georgians had already pursued an aggressive policy south of the Caucasus for decades. After extending their influence into Azerbaijan, they repeatedly campaigned toward the Lake Van Basin, launching expeditions against cities such as Ahlat, Erchish, and Malazgirt. Internal instability weakened many local rulers, making these regions vulnerable to repeated Georgian raids. Although several campaigns were eventually repelled through alliances between neighboring Muslim rulers, Georgian ambitions remained undiminished, and the struggle for control of eastern Anatolia continued. These broader conflicts directly affected the Empire of Trebizond. Its southern frontier bordered many of the contested regions where Seljuks, Georgians, and Ayyubids competed for influence. Cities including Erzurum, Erzincan, Bayburt, Koyulisar, and Niksar became strategic frontiers separating rival spheres of power. Every victory or defeat in eastern Anatolia altered the security of Trebizond itself, forcing its rulers to navigate an increasingly unstable political landscape. The Seljuk conquest of Erzurum in 1202 represented another turning point. By ending the rule of the Seljukids, the Seljuks established direct authority over one of the most important cities in eastern Anatolia and appointed Mughith al-Din Tugril Shah as its governor. Tugril Shah soon controlled neighboring Bayburt, only a short distance south of Trabzon, demonstrating how limited the territorial reach of the Empire of Trebizond actually was. While the Komnenian rulers dominated the narrow coastal strip along the Black Sea, the Seljuks increasingly controlled the mountain passes leading into the Anatolian interior. The relationship between Georgia and the Empire of Trebizond has long fascinated historians. Some earlier scholars argued that Georgia exercised considerable influence over the empire or even occupied parts of its eastern territories after the Battle of Yassi-Chemen in 1230. Others suggested that the Komnenian court adopted elements of Georgian political culture and maintained exceptionally close dynastic ties with the Georgian royal family. Yet many modern historians reject the idea that Trebizond ever became politically subordinate to Georgia. They point instead to the empire's unmistakably Byzantine institutions, its aristocratic titles, and its persistent effort to preserve the ceremonial traditions of Constantinople. Even if Georgian artistic and architectural influences appeared in certain regions, the Empire of Trebizond remained fundamentally Byzantine in its political identity and administrative structure. Meanwhile, power struggles within the Seljuk dynasty further complicated the situation. Rival princes competed for influence while forging shifting alliances with Armenian nobles, Ayyubid rulers, and regional governors. When Ala al-Din Keykubat finally secured the Seljuk throne, he moved quickly to strengthen his eastern frontier through diplomacy as well as conquest. Alliances with influential Ayyubid rulers reinforced through dynastic marriages helped stabilize eastern Anatolia and allowed the Seljuks to concentrate their attention on expanding their authority across the Black Sea region. In this increasingly interconnected world, military campaigns, commercial interests, and diplomatic marriages were all part of the same struggle for supremacy, and the Empire of Trebizond stood at the very center of that contest. During the 1220s, eastern Anatolia became the stage for an increasingly complex web of political alliances, dynastic marriages, and military rivalries. As the balance of power shifted, nearly every ruler in the region searched for new partners capable of countering the growing influence of the Seljuk Sultanate. One of the most remarkable diplomatic initiatives came from Mughith al-Din Tugril Shah, the ruler of Erzurum. Hoping to strengthen ties with the Kingdom of Georgia after the death of King Georgi, he proposed a marriage between his son, David, and the new Georgian queen, Rusudan. The proposal was accepted only after the prince agreed to convert to Christianity, demonstrating that political necessity often outweighed religious divisions during this turbulent period. Despite these developments, there is little convincing evidence that Tugril Shah ever became a vassal of the Empire of Trebizond, as some earlier historians once suggested. The political landscape was equally complicated further west. The Menguchekids, one of the earliest Turkish dynasties established after the Battle of Manzikert, controlled important cities such as Kema, Erzincan, Divri, and Şebinkarahisar. In their early history, they maintained surprisingly cooperative relations with neighboring Byzantine frontier lords. At one stage, Mengucek Gazi even formed an alliance with the Byzantine governor Konstantinos Gabras against the Danish Mendids. Although both leaders were eventually captured during the conflict, the episode illustrates how alliances in medieval Anatolia were shaped far more by political interests than by religion alone. Under the long and prosperous reign of Fakhr al-Din Behramshah, Erzincan developed into one of the leading cultural centers of Muslim Anatolia. Poets, scholars, theologians, and mystics gathered at his court, transforming the city into an intellectual crossroads between Persia and Anatolia. Yet Behramshah carefully balanced diplomacy with independence. Even though he acknowledged Seljuk supremacy and strengthened relations through marriage with the Seljuk royal family, he remained cautious about allowing Konya to dominate eastern Anatolia completely. His policies reflected the delicate position of many regional rulers who depended upon Seljuk support while simultaneously seeking to preserve their own autonomy. Following Behramshah's death, the situation became even more unstable. His successor, Ala al-Din Davud Shah, openly joined coalitions opposed to Seljuk expansion. He cooperated with the Ayyubids, maintained relations with other regional powers, and even supported the Nizari Ismailis of Alamut despite Seljuk hostility toward them. By controlling strategic strongholds such as Kema, the Menguchekids became one of several frontier dynasties attempting to resist the growing centralization pursued by Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad. By this stage, the southern frontier of the Empire of Trebizond was surrounded by a patchwork of competing Turkish principalities. The Danish Mendids, Menguchekids, Seljukids, and local frontier rulers frequently shifted their alliances according to changing political circumstances. The Seljuk sultans sought to absorb these semi-independent dynasties one by one, while the Ayyubids and the Kingdom of Georgia encouraged anti-Seljuk coalitions in an effort to preserve the regional balance of power. The strategic city of Erzurum became the focal point of this struggle, controlling the principal roads that connected eastern Anatolia with both the Caucasus and the Black Sea. At the same time, the competition between the Seljuks and Trebizond for control of the trade routes leading to Sinope, Crimea, and the northern Black Sea formed another crucial dimension of this wider geopolitical contest. A new and unexpected force entered this already volatile landscape in 1224 when Jalal al-Din Khwarazm-Shah, fleeing the Mongol advance across Central Asia, arrived in the Near East. Determined to rebuild his shattered empire, he forged temporary alliances with both the Ayyubids and the Georgians, rapidly expanding his influence across eastern Anatolia and the South Caucasus. Within only a few years, his armies occupied Tbilisi, pushed deep into the Caucasus, and established direct frontiers with the Empire of Trebizond. His spectacular rise dramatically reduced Georgian influence and transformed the political map of the region almost overnight. The rulers of Trebizond almost certainly viewed these developments with growing concern. Contemporary evidence suggests that the empire aligned itself with the Georgian kingdom and its allies against Jalal al-Din's expanding power. Troops associated with Trebizond, including contingents of the Laz, renowned for their military reputation, together with Christian Kipchak warriors serving in the Georgian army, participated in campaigns against the Khwarezmian forces. Despite their determination, the coalition proved unable to halt Jalal al-Din's advance, and the Georgian alliance suffered a decisive defeat. The campaign demonstrated how deeply the Empire of Trebizond had become involved in the wider struggles unfolding across the Caucasus and eastern Anatolia. Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad closely monitored these dramatic changes. Fully aware that Jalal al-Din had emerged as the strongest military power in eastern Anatolia, and with the Mongol threat looming ever closer, the Seljuk ruler initially attempted diplomacy. He dispatched embassies, lavished gifts, and even proposed a dynastic marriage between his son and the Khwarezm Shah's daughter. Every effort failed. Convinced that Jalal al-Din intended to challenge Seljuk authority, Kaikubad abandoned negotiation in favor of military action. The opportunity came when leading nobles from Erzincan rebelled against their ruler and sought refuge at the Seljuk court. Using this crisis as a pretext, Kaikubad launched a major eastern campaign in 1227 to 1228. His true objective was not simply to capture another frontier city, but to dismantle the political network supporting Jalal al-Din. To prevent reinforcements from arriving, Seljuk armies rapidly occupied Erzurum, Kema, and later Kogonya, cutting communication between their enemies before turning toward the heart of eastern Anatolia. Although the approach of Ayyubid forces eventually forced the Sultan to suspend the campaign, his strategy revealed a broader ambition: to eliminate every rival capable of challenging Seljuk supremacy and establish undisputed control over eastern Anatolia. Following the successful conclusion of his northern campaign, Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad redirected his attention toward the increasingly unstable politics of eastern Anatolia. By 1228, another Seljuk army had been dispatched towards Sinope, reflecting the Sultan's determination to secure every strategic route connecting the Black Sea with the Anatolian interior. At the same time, growing evidence suggests that Emperor Andronikos I Gidos of Trebizond was quietly supporting the coalition forming against Seljuk expansion. Although direct proof remains limited, the empire's diplomatic moves indicate that Trebizond regarded Kaikubad's rapid rise with increasing concern. A far greater challenge was emerging from the east. Jalal al-Din Khwarazmshah, having rebuilt his power in Azerbaijan, was steadily extending his influence into eastern Anatolia. Recognizing the danger before it became irreversible, Kaikubad abandoned any hope of dealing with the crisis alone. Instead, he launched an ambitious diplomatic campaign, sending embassies to the Ayyubids, the Kingdom of Georgia, and the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. His objective was straightforward: unite every major regional power against the rapidly expanding Khwarezmian state before it could dominate the entire region. Yet, diplomacy soon encountered new obstacles. The Seljuk occupation of Erzurum alarmed the Ayyubids, who regarded the city as a crucial buffer protecting northern Mesopotamia. Although relations became increasingly strained, Kaikubad remained reluctant to provoke a complete rupture. As long as Jalal al-Din remained the greatest threat in the east, he needed the Ayyubids as partners rather than enemies. The political balance therefore became extraordinarily delicate, with every ruler attempting to weaken one rival without strengthening another. The crisis reached a new level in 1229 when Jalal al-Din laid siege to the strategic fortress of Ahlat, one of the most valuable cities in eastern Anatolia. Contemporary accounts indicate that Andronikos of Trebizond not only acknowledged Jalal al-Din's authority, but also provided military assistance during the campaign. Kaikubad desperately attempted to prevent the city's fall, dispatching envoys who urged the Khwarezmshah to lift the siege and leave Ahlat in Ayyubid hands. Jalal al-Din refused every proposal. Convinced that possession of Ahlat would give him command of eastern Anatolia, he continued the assault until the city finally surrendered in 1230. The capture of Ahlat fundamentally transformed regional politics. By occupying the fortress, Jalal al-Din appeared poised to dominate the entire eastern frontier, making direct confrontation with the Seljuk Sultanate almost inevitable. For Kaikubad, diplomacy had reached its limit. Every attempt to negotiate had failed, and military action now seemed the only remaining option. Ironically, Jalal al-Din's greatest triumph also marked the beginning of his downfall. By taking Ahlat, he united nearly all of his rivals against him. The changing balance of power also forced other regional rulers to make difficult choices. Rukn al-Din Jihanshah, the ruler of Erzurum, found himself caught between the expanding Seljuks and the increasingly powerful Khwarezmian state. Remaining neutral was no longer possible. After initially receiving Seljuk envoys demanding his submission, Jihanshah instead traveled to meet Jalal al-Din personally, encouraging him to launch an invasion of Anatolia. His decision placed Erzurum firmly within the anti-Seljuk camp and further escalated tensions across the region. Realizing that a decisive confrontation could no longer be avoided, Kaikubad assembled the largest coalition he had yet commanded. The Seljuks, Ayyubids, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, and several Turkoman principalities combined their forces to confront Jalal al-Din's army. The two sides finally met in the valley of Yasu-Chemen in the summer of 1230. The battle ended in a crushing Seljuk victory. Jalal al-Din's once formidable army collapsed, and the Khwarezmian ruler fled the battlefield with only a fraction of his remaining forces. The Empire of Trebizond almost certainly stood on the losing side of this conflict. Earlier agreements between Andronikos I Gidos and Rukn al-Din Jihanshah, together with later historical accounts, strongly indicate that Trebizond supported Jalal al-Din during the campaign. This interpretation, first advanced by 19th century historian Jakob Philipp Falmeraya, has since gained broad acceptance among modern scholars. For the Komnenian rulers, backing Jalal al-Din represented another attempt to counterbalance Seljuk power, even if it ultimately proved unsuccessful. After the disaster at Yasu-Chemen, the remnants of the Khwarezmian army scattered in every direction. Medieval Muslim chroniclers report that many survivors fled toward the territory of Trebizond, seeking refuge under Emperor Andronikos. Others attempted to escape through the rugged mountain passes of northeastern Anatolia, where countless soldiers reportedly perished after falling from steep cliffs during their desperate retreat. Although the sources disagree about the precise route taken by the refugees, they agree that the Khwarezmian army ceased to exist as an effective military force after the battle. Some modern historians argue that the Seljuks exploited this victory even further by pursuing the retreating Khwarezmians into the frontier regions and rapidly occupying Erzurum before turning their attention toward the Black Sea. Whether every detail of these later operations can be confirmed or not, the consequences of Yasu-Chemen were unmistakable. The defeat destroyed Jalal al-Din's ambitions, secured Seljuk supremacy across eastern Anatolia, and once again left the Empire of Trebizond searching for new allies in an increasingly dangerous political landscape. By the late 1220s, the struggle for control of eastern Anatolia had entered a decisive phase. After consolidating his authority along the Black Sea coast, Sultan Ala al-Din Kaikubad recognized that the greatest danger to his kingdom no longer came from the Byzantine frontier, but from the rapidly expanding power of Jalal al-Din Khwarezm Shah. At the same time, the Empire of Trebizond, under Emperor Andronikos I Gidos, appears to have aligned itself with the growing anti-Seljuk coalition. Although the surviving evidence is fragmentary, many historians believe that Trebizond quietly supported those regional powers attempting to contain Seljuk expansion. Rather than relying solely on military force, Kaikubad first turned to diplomacy. He dispatched embassies to the Ayyubids, the Kingdom of Georgia, and the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, hoping to unite the major powers of the region against Jalal al-Din before the Khwarezmian ruler became unstoppable. His strategy reflected a clear understanding of the changing political landscape. If eastern Anatolia fell under Khwarezmian control, the Seljuk Sultanate itself would soon face an existential threat. Yet events unfolded faster than diplomacy could keep pace. The Seljuk occupation of Erzurum created new tensions with the Ayyubids, who regarded the city as a vital buffer protecting their northern frontier. Although relations between the two states deteriorated, Kaikubad carefully avoided provoking a complete break. He understood that confronting Jalal al-Din while simultaneously fighting the Ayyubids would stretch his kingdom beyond its limits. The crisis deepened in 1229 when Jalal al-Din launched a determined siege of Ahlat, one of the most strategically important cities in eastern Anatolia. Contemporary sources indicate that Emperor Andronikos of Trebizond not only acknowledged Jalal al-Din's authority, but also contributed military support to his campaign. Alarmed by these developments, Kaikubad attempted one final diplomatic intervention, urging Jalal al-Din to abandon the siege and leave the city in Ayyubid hands. The proposal was rejected. Confident that possession of Ahlat would secure control over the entire region, Jalal al-Din pressed forward until the fortress finally fell in the spring of 1230. The capture of Ahlat proved to be a turning point. What appeared to be Jalal al-Din's greatest victory ultimately united nearly all of his rivals against him. For Kaikubad, every possibility of compromise had now disappeared. He concluded that only a decisive military campaign could remove the growing Khwarezmian threat once and for all. Meanwhile, regional rulers found themselves forced to choose sides. Rukn al-Din Jihanshah, the ruler of Erzurum, initially faced heavy pressure from the Seljuks to submit, but instead sought an alliance with Jalal al-Din. His decision reflected the impossible position of frontier governors caught between competing empires. By openly encouraging the Khwarezmian ruler to invade Anatolia, Jihanshah helped push the region toward an inevitable showdown. Kayqubad answered by assembling one of the largest military coalitions of his reign. The Seljuks, Ayyubids, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, and several Turkoman principalities combined their forces against Jalal al-Din. The decisive confrontation came in August 1230 at the Battle of Yassi Chemen. The result was overwhelming. Jalal al-Din's army was shattered, his ambitions of creating a new Eastern Empire collapsed, and the balance of power across Anatolia changed almost overnight. There is little doubt that the Empire of Trebizond stood on the losing side of this conflict. Earlier diplomatic agreements between Andronikos I, Gidos, and Rukn al-Din Jihanshah, together with later Byzantine and Western accounts, strongly suggest that Trebizond supported Jalal al-Din during the campaign. For the Komnenian rulers, the alliance represented another attempt to counter Seljuk dominance, but it ultimately tied the empire to a cause that ended in complete defeat. The aftermath of Yassi Chemen was chaotic. The surviving Khwarezmian soldiers fled northward through the mountains, many seeking refuge within the territory of Trebizond. Medieval chroniclers describe a desperate retreat in which exhausted troops struggled across the rugged highlands, with countless men reportedly losing their lives while attempting to escape through steep mountain passes. Although historians continue to debate the precise routes followed by these fugitives, there is broad agreement that the Khwarezmian army never recovered from the disaster. Some modern scholars argue that the Seljuks immediately exploited their victory by occupying Erzurum and pursuing the remnants of the Khwarezmian forces toward the Black Sea frontier. Whether or not every stage of that pursuit can be confirmed, one consequence is beyond dispute. After Yassi Chemen, the Empire of Trebizond abandoned any hope of influencing the balance of power in eastern Anatolia through Khwarezmian alliances. Instead, the empire returned to a more cautious policy focused on survival. From 1230 onward, however, a new reality emerged. The rise of the Mongol Empire quickly overshadowed every previous rivalry. As Mongol armies advanced toward Anatolia, conflict between the Seljuks and Trebizond largely disappeared. Instead of confronting one another, the two states entered a prolonged period of relative peace. Seljuk nobles could travel freely to Trabzon, while diplomatic and religious contacts continued without major interruption. Contemporary travelers even remarked that, whenever requested, the Emperor of Trebizond stood ready to provide military assistance to the Seljuk Sultan, a strong indication that the empire continued to recognize Seljuk overlordship for at least another decade. Ironically, this era of political dependence coincided with remarkable economic prosperity. During the reign of Emperor Manuel I, Trabzon experienced one of the wealthiest periods in its history. After the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, the great commercial arteries of Asia shifted dramatically. Instead of flowing west through Mesopotamia toward the Mediterranean, caravans increasingly followed the Tabriz-Trabzon corridor, carrying silks, spices, precious metals, and luxury goods to the Black Sea. The city's markets flourished, its coinage spread across neighboring regions, including western Georgia, and Trabzon re-emerged as one of the most important commercial gateways between Asia and Europe. The Mongol invasion transformed the political order of Anatolia even more profoundly. The crushing Battle of Köse Dağ in 1243 destroyed Seljuk supremacy, replacing it with Mongol dominance across much of the region. Although the Seljuk state survived in name, real authority steadily slipped into Mongol hands, while numerous independent Turkoman principalities emerged across Anatolia. The Empire of Trebizond adapted quickly to this new reality. Initially maintaining its ties with the Seljuks, it gradually adjusted its diplomacy to accommodate the Mongol Empire, recognizing that the center of power had shifted once again. Evidence from both Byzantine and Muslim chroniclers suggests that Emperor Manuel I contributed troops to the Seljuk army before the Battle of Kose Dağ, although the exact size of his contingent remains uncertain. Following the Seljuk defeat, however, Trebizond appears to have accepted the new political order and established relations with the Mongols themselves. By the middle of the 13th century, travelers passing through the region described Trabzon as part of the wider Mongol sphere of influence. Despite this new dependence, the ambitions of the Komnenian emperors never completely disappeared. With the rise of Mongol power weakening old political barriers, hopes of one day recovering Sinope and reopening the road toward Constantinople once again became central to the foreign policy of the Empire of Trebizond. The loss of Sinope in 1214 remained an open wound in the memory of the Empire of Trebizond. The city was far more than a strategic fortress. It was the key to the western Black Sea and the gateway toward Constantinople. As long as Sinope remained in Seljuk hands, the Komnenian emperors had little hope of restoring the influence they had lost after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1204. Consequently, recovering the port became one of the central objectives of Trebizond's foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The opportunity finally arrived in 1254. On June 24th, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos successfully captured Sinope, achieving one of the greatest military successes in the history of the Empire of Trebizond. Contemporary evidence for the conquest is surprisingly limited. The clearest surviving testimony comes from a brief Greek note written in a synaxarion at Sudak in Crimea, which simply records that on that day Komnenos captured Sinope. Despite its brevity, this small entry provides the only precise contemporary date for one of the most significant events in the empire's history. The political circumstances surrounding the conquest were equally remarkable. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had become the dominant power across Anatolia and the Near East. Their decision to make Tabriz the principal political and commercial center of the region transformed the economic importance of Trabzon, whose harbor now served as one of the main gateways linking Asia with the Black Sea. Although surviving sources reveal little about direct Mongol involvement in the capture of Sinope, the wider political situation strongly favored Trebizond. The chaos created by Mongol expansion weakened Seljuk authority and offered Manuel an opportunity that earlier emperors had never possessed. Sinope itself was no longer controlled solely by the Seljuks. Contemporary accounts indicate that the city had fallen under the protection of the Golden Horde, and its governor, Shuja al-Din, ruled with authority granted through a Mongol charter. In the Mongol political system, major territorial changes required formal approval from the Great Khan, making it unlikely that Manuel could have occupied Sinop without at least tacit Mongol consent. Many modern historians therefore believe that the emperor secured permission through diplomatic channels before launching his expedition, taking advantage of the political transition that followed the accession of Möngke Khan. Yet, the triumph carried its own dangers. Whoever controlled Sinope also controlled one of the most profitable commercial routes across the Black Sea. Merchants sailing between Crimea, the Volga Basin, and Anatolia depended upon the harbor, and any disruption threatened the wider trading network overseen by the Mongols and the Golden Horde. Consequently, Trebizond's conquest immediately created new political tensions. While the empire had finally recovered its greatest strategic prize, maintaining control over the city proved far more difficult than capturing it. Indeed, the success proved temporary. Although the Mongol upheavals allowed Trebizond to hold Sinope for nearly 3 decades, the city eventually returned to Turkish control. Even so, Manuel's achievement demonstrated how effectively the Empire of Trebizond exploited the changing balance of power created by the Mongol conquest. Rather than confronting stronger neighbors directly, the Komnenian rulers skillfully used diplomacy, shifting alliances, and moments of regional instability to pursue objectives that had once seemed impossible. The wider political situation also remained unstable. After the death of Sultan Giyath al-Din Kaykhusraw II, the Seljuk succession became increasingly entangled with Mongol politics. Rival princes competed for the throne while seeking recognition from the Great Khan, whose approval had become essential for legitimate rule. According to contemporary chroniclers, The new sultan argued that he could not personally travel to the Mongol court because his enemies, including the rulers of the Greeks and the Armenians, might exploit his absence. Many historians believe the Greek ruler mentioned in these accounts referred not to the Empire of Nicaea, but to Emperor Manuel of Trebizond, whose recent seizure of Sinope had dramatically increased tensions between the two states. At the same time, Manuel sought new diplomatic opportunities beyond Anatolia. In 1253, he dispatched ambassadors carrying magnificent gifts to King Louis IX of France, proposing a dynastic marriage between the Comnenian dynasty and the French royal family. Louis politely declined the offer, but suggested that the emperor instead strengthen relations with the Byzantine rulers in Constantinople. Although the marriage never materialized, the episode illustrates how actively Trebizond sought powerful allies capable of strengthening its position against both the Seljuks and its Byzantine rivals. Despite the dramatic recovery of Sinope, geography ultimately favored Trebizond's enemies. By the 1260s, Byzantine historians observed that nearly every major Black Sea port west of Giresun had either fallen under Turkish control or become isolated from its hinterland. Land communications between Constantinople and many coastal cities had effectively disappeared as Turkoman groups established themselves across northern Anatolia. Trebizond itself survived largely because of its maritime connections rather than its control of the interior. In this increasingly fragmented landscape, even temporary possession of Sinope represented an extraordinary achievement. Meanwhile, relations between the Empire of Trebizond and the restored Byzantine Empire gradually improved. Diplomatic negotiations helped resolve long-standing disputes between the churches of Constantinople and Trabzon, and by 1260 to 1261, the Metropolitan of Trabzon formally acknowledged the authority of the Ecumenical Patriarch. This agreement brought to an end more than half a century of rivalry that had begun after the Fourth Crusade in 1204. With ecclesiastical unity restored and Constantinople once again under Byzantine rule, the Empire of Trebizond increasingly abandoned its earlier imperial ambitions and accepted its role as an independent Black Sea kingdom whose prosperity rested on trade, diplomacy, and careful adaptation to the changing politics of the Mongol world. According to the chronicler Michael Panaretos, the reign of Emperor Manuel I represented one of the brightest chapters in the history of the Empire of Trebizond. He praised Manuel as both a capable ruler and an accomplished military leader whose government brought stability and prosperity to the empire. At first glance, this glowing assessment seems surprising. The mid-13th century was an era of constant political upheaval, regional wars, and Mongol expansion. Yet Panaretos's admiration is echoed by several Armenian writers of the same period, suggesting that despite these challenges, Trebizond managed not only to survive, but for a time, to strengthen its position. Like the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, it escaped the worst destruction of the Mongol invasions and even achieved modest territorial gains. This period of success, however, proved remarkably brief. Soon after Manuel recovered Sinope, the political landscape changed dramatically. The empire entered a prolonged era of internal instability, dynastic rivalries, and territorial decline. Even more damaging was the gradual loss of Mongol support, which had previously protected Trebizond from more powerful rivals. Forced to adapt, the Comnenian emperors increasingly sought alliances with the emerging Turkmen principalities that had risen from the collapse of Seljuk authority. What had once been a confident regional power now found itself struggling simply to preserve its independence. Following Manuel's death in 1263, his eldest son, Andronikos II, inherited the throne, marking what many historians regard as the beginning of a new and far more difficult era. Political unity weakened, aristocratic factions became increasingly influential, and imperial authority steadily eroded. His successor, George Komnenos, spent much of his reign attempting to suppress noble conspiracies while confronting growing threats from every direction. While Trebizond wrestled with internal problems, the Seljuks prepared to recover their greatest lost possession. In 1265 to 1266, the influential statesman Mu'in al-Din Pervane launched a determined campaign to retake Sinope. Before beginning the siege, he presented the city's defenders with a formal decree issued by the Ilkhanid Mongols, declaring that Sinope had been granted to him by Mongol authority. The message was unmistakable. This was not merely a Seljuk offensive, but an operation carried out with the approval of the dominant power in Anatolia. The campaign gathered strength from across northern Anatolia. Thousands of Chepni Turkmen joined the siege alongside Seljuk forces, while Emperor Andronikos II attempted to reinforce the city by dispatching a contingent of Frankish troops. Their arrival made little difference. Seljuk forces destroyed the incoming fleet inside the harbor, cutting off any realistic chance of relief. After a lengthy siege lasting nearly 2 years, Sinope finally fell back into Seljuk hands. Pervain then secured a dozen nearby fortresses that had previously acknowledged Trebizond, demolishing many of them because they were too difficult to defend permanently. The loss of Sinope reflected a much broader shift in regional politics. By this stage, the Ilkhanid Mongols had consolidated their authority over the Seljuk Sultanate and no longer viewed the Empire of Trebizond as an essential ally. New strategic realities demanded different priorities. The rapid rise of the Mamluk Sultanate posed a far greater challenge to Mongol ambitions than the small Black Sea kingdom ever could. Supporting the Seljuks against Trebizond therefore served Mongol interests far better than preserving the independence of the Komnenian dynasty. Facing increasing isolation, the rulers of Trebizond searched for entirely new diplomatic partners. During the reign of George Komnenos, the empire opened contacts with both the Mamluks and Charles of Anjou, seeking alliances capable of balancing Ilkhanid influence. Evidence from contemporary Muslim sources suggests that friendly relations with Egypt had already begun before the final loss of Sinope. In 1264, a diplomatic mission sent by Sultan Baybars visited Trebizond, carrying official correspondence to the imperial court. The contents of the letter remain unknown, but historians believe that the future of Sinope and the changing balance of power around the Black Sea almost certainly formed part of the discussions. These developments reveal how dramatically Trebizond's foreign policy evolved during the second half of the 13th century. For decades, relations with the Seljuks had revolved around a single objective: possession of Sinope. The city represented much more than an important harbor. It was the western gateway of the Black Sea and the first step toward Paphlagonia, Bithynia, and ultimately Constantinople itself. As long as the Komnenian emperors dreamed of restoring their dynasty to the imperial capital, recovering Sinope remained an absolute necessity. Once that ambition became impossible, Trebizond gradually abandoned its imperial aspirations and accepted the reality of surviving as a small but strategically important Black Sea state. The reign of George Komnenos unfolded during one of the most turbulent periods in medieval Near Eastern history. The Ilkhanids tightened their grip over Anatolia, the restored Byzantine Empire sought to reassert its influence, the Mamluks inflicted major defeats on Mongol armies, and new diplomatic initiatives attempted to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. Although the surviving sources provide only fragmentary information about George himself, they make clear that every one of these international developments influenced the policies pursued in Trebizond. Despite growing political uncertainty, the empire entered an era of extraordinary commercial prosperity. After the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, the great east-west trade routes shifted northward, making the Tabriz-Trabzon corridor one of the busiest commercial highways in Eurasia. Caravans loaded with silk, spices, precious metals, textiles, and luxury goods crossed the mountains to Trabzon before continuing by sea to Mediterranean markets. Tabriz developed into a thriving international metropolis visited by merchants and missionaries from across Europe, while Trabzon became its principal maritime outlet. Even the monetary system and systems of weights used in the two cities became closely connected, reflecting the depth of their economic relationship. Travelers such as Marco Polo later described Trabzon as a remarkably prosperous trading center where merchants accumulated immense fortunes. At the height of this commercial boom, tens of thousands of pack animals carried goods annually between Tabriz and the Black Sea, making the empire wealthy despite its limited territory. Only with the gradual collapse of Ilkhanid authority in the early 14th century did this remarkable period of prosperity begin to fade, and the volume of trade would never again reach the same heights for centuries to come. During the 13th century, the Empire of Trebizond was shaped as much by internal politics as by foreign threats. Real power often rested not solely with the emperor, but with influential local aristocrats known as the archonts. These wealthy Greek and Laz landowning families had dominated regional affairs long before the empire was founded in 1204, and they successfully preserved their privileges throughout both the Komnenian and later Ottoman periods. Their political influence was immense. While they lacked the authority to replace the imperial dynasty itself, they possessed enough power to depose emperors whose policies threatened their interests and replace them with another member of the Komnenos family. In Trebizond, loyalty belonged to the dynasty rather than to any individual ruler. The strategic position of the empire made governing even more difficult. To the west lay Sinope, controlled by the powerful Seljuk statesman Mu'in al-Din Pervan under Mongol authority. To the east stretched the Georgian kingdoms, themselves constantly exposed to Mongol invasions. At the same time, the prosperity of Trebizond depended overwhelmingly on customs revenues collected from the Tabriz-Trabzon trade route. Every emperor therefore faced a delicate balancing act, satisfying the ambitions of the local aristocracy while maintaining workable relations with the Ilkhanid Mongols, neighboring Georgian rulers, and the restored Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. These competing pressures ultimately undermined the reign of George Komnenos. During the 1270s, the political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean became increasingly unstable. The Mamluk Sultanate expanded into northern Mesopotamia. The Ilkhanids struggled to contain them. Charles of Anjou attempted to build an anti-Byzantine coalition in the west, and Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos strengthened his own position through diplomatic marriages and closer cooperation with both the papacy and the Mongols. In 1265, Michael even married one of his daughters to the Ilkhanid ruler Abaka Khan, while 2 years later he forged another dynastic alliance with the Georgian royal family. Together, these agreements threatened to isolate Trebizond politically. George Komnenos responded cautiously. Given Trebizond's exposed position on the Black Sea, he appears to have concluded that cooperation with the Byzantine-Mongol-Georgian alignment offered greater security than relying on the more distant Mamluk Sultanate. Nevertheless, his government also maintained contacts with the Western powers. Around 1266 to 1267, Charles of Anjou sought to establish an alliance with Trebizond through Italian merchants active in the city's commerce. Although George's reply has not survived, subsequent developments suggest that he instead strengthened relations with eastern Georgia while carefully avoiding complete dependence on any single power. Religion soon became another arena of political competition. At the Second Council of Lyons in 1274, Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII attempted to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches in order to secure Western support for his empire. Trebizond viewed these efforts with deep suspicion. George Komnenos openly sympathized with the opponents of church union, many of whom considered Michael's religious policy a betrayal of orthodoxy. His resistance further strained relations with Constantinople and reinforced the long-standing rivalry between the two Byzantine successor states. Meanwhile, events elsewhere in Anatolia dramatically altered the balance of power. In 1277, the Mamluks inflicted a major defeat upon the Mongols near Elbistan. Although Sultan Baybars died shortly afterward, the battle created widespread uncertainty throughout Anatolia. Local rulers who had previously depended on Mongol protection suddenly found themselves facing an unpredictable future. Sources do not clearly indicate whether Trebizond contributed troops or tribute during this crisis, but they do suggest that George Komnenos ultimately reaffirmed his loyalty to Abaka Khan, recognizing that the Ilkhanids remained the dominant military force despite their setback. George's position nevertheless became increasingly fragile. Internal opposition grew stronger, while shifting international alliances steadily eroded his authority. After his removal from the throne, his successor John II Komnenos abandoned many of his predecessor's policies. Determined to restore stability, John immediately sought reconciliation with Constantinople. He gave up the traditional Komnenian claim to the Roman imperial title and strengthened relations with Michael VIII Palaiologos through a dynastic marriage. At the same time, he encouraged closer commercial ties with Italian merchants and aligned Trebizond once again with the Ilkhanids against the Mamluks. His accession marked one of the most significant changes in the diplomatic orientation of the empire during the 13th century. Political instability, however, did not disappear. Modern historians continue to debate George Komnenos' character and abilities, with some portraying him as an ineffective ruler, while others argue that he successfully resisted repeated aristocratic conspiracies. Whatever the truth, the empire remained deeply divided. When John II traveled to Constantinople to marry into the Palaiologos dynasty in 1282, Georgian forces attempted to exploit his absence by attacking Trebizond, though the invasion ultimately failed. Shortly afterward, the deposed George himself launched an unsuccessful attempt to recover the throne before being captured and imprisoned. The struggles continued even after George's defeat. A brief reign by Empress Theodora revealed how influential the Archon families had become in determining imperial succession. Although the exact circumstances of her accession and removal remain obscure, surviving coinage confirms that she briefly shared or exercised imperial authority. During these years, Trebizond once again reconsidered its foreign policy, with a confidence in Mongol protection. Fading, the empire cautiously explored closer relations with the neighboring Georgian kingdoms, demonstrating once more that survival on the Black Sea frontier depended upon constant diplomatic flexibility rather than permanent alliances. The final decades of the 13th century exposed the growing fragility of the Empire of Trebizond, where regional politics became increasingly entangled with the ambitions of the Ilkhanid Mongols, the restored Byzantine Empire, and the neighboring Georgian kingdoms. Although the surviving chronicles occasionally contradict one another, they all suggest that Emperor George Komnenos became deeply involved in the power struggles that dominated the Caucasus and Anatolia. Armenian sources even claim that the Ilkhanid ruler Abaka Khan was responsible for George's death, while Byzantine accounts instead describe the emperor being captured in an ambush during a military expedition. Despite these differences, the chronology preserved by the Trapezontine chronicler Michael Panaretos is generally regarded as the most reliable, particularly for events directly connected with the empire itself. The exact nature of the relationship between the Empire of Trebizond and the Ilkhanid Empire remains difficult to define. After the Battle of Kosei Dağ in 1243, Trebizond acknowledged Mongol supremacy, but the extent of that dependence is still debated. Some earlier historians argued that Mongol authority over the empire effectively ended after the death of Hulagu Khan in 1265. Yet other evidence points in the opposite direction. Even decades later, Ilkhanid officials continued discussing military expeditions toward Abkhazia and Trabzon, indicating that the empire was still regarded as part of the Mongol sphere of influence. Considering Trabzon's crucial position on the lucrative trade route linking Tabriz with the Black Sea, it is difficult to imagine that the Ilkhans simply ignored one of the region's most valuable commercial gateways. Unlike many rulers who traveled to the imperial court, Abaka Khan never personally visited Trabzon. Instead, he usually received foreign ambassadors in his seasonal capitals at Aran, Mugan, Tabriz, or the mountain pastures of Alada. Historians therefore believe that Emperor George Komnenos almost certainly visited the Ilkhanid court himself, just as neighboring rulers, including the powerful Seljuk statesman Mu'in al-Din Pervain and the Georgian kings, had done before him. Such diplomatic journeys were an essential part of maintaining political legitimacy within the Mongol world. Panaretos records that George was captured in 1280, a date that closely matches Abaka's known movements through the region. This agreement between the emperor's itinerary and the Ilkhanid ruler's campaigns has strengthened confidence in Panaretos's chronology. Although some modern historians have suggested that George may actually have been executed on Abaka's orders, the surviving evidence remains inconclusive. Another interpretation argues that the emperor was eventually released and later returned to political life, explaining why later sources still refer to him after his supposed death. Whatever the truth, the episode illustrates how closely the fate of Trebizond's rulers depended upon the decisions made at the Mongol court rather than within their own empire. Like nearly every neighboring state, Trebizond demonstrated its loyalty to the Ilkhans through tribute and diplomatic submission. Shortly after Abaka returned to Tabriz in 1279 to 1280, George Komnenos reportedly dispatched silver payments acknowledging his status as a Mongol vassal. Whether these obligations were fulfilled through coinage, bullion, or other valuable gifts remains uncertain, but the payments underline the practical realities of imperial survival. Political independence often depended less on military strength than on maintaining favorable relations with the dominant power of the age. A dramatic change followed the accession of John II Komnenos. Unlike his predecessors, John abandoned the long-standing Komnenian claim to the title of Emperor of the Romans, a title that had symbolized Trebizond's continuing claim to the Byzantine imperial inheritance ever since 1204. Instead, he pursued reconciliation with Constantinople and the Palaiologos dynasty, recognizing that the political realities of the late 13th century no longer allowed Trebizond to compete for the Byzantine throne. Significantly, this shift occurred only after the empire had permanently lost any realistic chance of recovering Sinope, the strategic port that had once connected the Komnenian state with western Anatolia and the road to Constantinople. Under Alexios II, who ruled from 1297 to 1330, this transformation became even more pronounced. Rather than pursuing grand imperial ambitions, the empire increasingly behaved as a regional Black Sea kingdom focused on protecting its commercial interests. One striking example came in 1313, when Alexios concluded an alliance with Ghazi Chelebi of Sinope against the Genoese. Only a century earlier, recovering Sinope had been viewed as essential to restoring Byzantine power. Now the rulers of Trebizond were cooperating with the Turkish lord who controlled the city in order to defend regional trade. The agreement symbolized how completely the empire's foreign policy had adapted to a changing political world. At the same time, the demographic landscape of the eastern Black Sea was undergoing profound change. As Chepni Turkmen advanced eastward from Sinope, the Byzantine population gradually retreated toward the coastal stronghold of Trabzon. Meanwhile, the eastern frontier experienced a different transformation. Long-standing tensions between the Georgians and the Kipchaks, who had settled in the Caucasus generations earlier, triggered new waves of migration. Under the leadership of Sargis, many Orthodox Kipchaks abandoned the Georgian kingdom and entered the service of the Ilkhans, receiving lands around Akaltsike before gradually expanding westward. Combined with earlier Kipchak communities already established in the Choru Valley, these migrations introduced a substantial Turkic population into Artvin, Rize, Trabzon, Gümüşhane, Giresun, and Ordu. Over time, these newcomers became an important element in the region's ethnic and cultural transformation. By the opening decades of the 14th century, the eastern Black Sea had evolved into a remarkably diverse frontier where Greek, Laz, Armenian, Georgian, Turkoman, and Kipchak communities coexisted, competed, and gradually reshaped the character of one of the most strategically significant regions of medieval Anatolia. As the 14th century approached, the political landscape surrounding Trabzon was becoming increasingly unstable. Across eastern Anatolia, old powers were weakening while new frontier states emerged from the ruins of the Seljuk world. According to the chronicler Michael Panaretos, the province of Chaldea, long regarded as the defensive heartland of the Empire of Trebizond, suffered significant territorial losses to Turkish forces sometime between 1280 and 1297. Yet the empire did not surrender without resistance. In 1301, Emperor Alexios II Komnenos launched a determined counteroffensive near Giresun, attacking both by land and sea. The campaign ended in a decisive imperial victory, and Panaretos records that one of the leading Turkish commanders was captured alive. Although the exact identity of this emir remains uncertain, many historians believe he was either Bayram Bey himself or a close member of his family, suggesting that the conflict marked one of the earliest major clashes between the Empire of Trebizond and the rising Turkish principalities of the eastern Black Sea. Only a few years later, in 1313, Bayram Bey appeared again in the historical record, this time as the founder of a new frontier principality centered around Ordu and its surrounding districts. His emergence symbolized a profound transformation taking place along the Black Sea coast. Rather than serving merely as raiders, the Turkmen had begun establishing permanent political states. Many scholars believe that the majority of Bayram Bey's followers belonged to the Chepni branch of the Oghuz Turks. This conclusion is supported by later Ottoman records, which show an overwhelming concentration of Chepni settlements throughout the region once controlled by the Bayramlı Principality. What had begun as seasonal migration was evolving into lasting political and demographic change. The roots of this transformation stretched back more than 2 centuries. Beginning in the early 12th century, waves of nomadic Turkmen entered Anatolia, gradually reshaping its ethnic, political, and cultural landscape. Initially, these pastoral communities occupied the central plateau before steadily pushing toward the western and northern frontiers. Throughout much of the 12th century, Byzantine emperors managed to slow this advance and even recovered several lost territories. Nevertheless, the Seljuk sultans never exercised complete control over the nomadic tribes. While the Turkmen formed the backbone of Seljuk military strength, they often ignored diplomatic agreements concluded between the Seljuk court and Byzantium. Even when peace treaties were signed, frontier raids frequently continued because tribal leaders answered to their own interests rather than to the central government. By the early 13th century, however, this first phase of migration had begun to change. Many nomadic families settled permanently, while others suffered heavy losses during continuous warfare against Byzantines, Armenians, Georgians, and rival Muslim powers. Just as this earlier migration began to stabilize, an even greater movement of people transformed Anatolia once again. The arrival of the Mongols in Central Asia forced countless Turkmen communities to abandon their ancestral lands and move westward through Iran into Anatolia. Entire tribal confederations crossed the plateau in search of safety, dramatically increasing the Turkic population throughout the peninsula. The impact of this migration was enormous. Turkmen groups spread across the fertile valleys of western Anatolia before expanding northward into Phrygia, Bithynia, and Paphlagonia. Byzantine historian George Pachymeres even records that Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos attempted to settle some of these migrants along the empire's eastern frontier, hoping to reduce the pressure created by the continuing Mongol advance. Instead of halting the transformation, these policies often accelerated it, further altering the demographic balance of the borderlands. By the opening years of the 14th century, eastern Anatolia had become a patchwork of competing states and frontier lordships. Although the Byzantine Empire recovered Constantinople from the Latins in 1261, it never regained the vast territories that had gradually passed into Turkish hands after the 11th century. More importantly, Byzantium itself underwent a profound ideological transformation. For centuries, the empire had presented itself as the universal Christian state and the legitimate heir of Rome. Yet repeated military defeats, the growing power of the Turks, and above all the traumatic capture of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade forced Byzantine rulers to reconsider their place in the world. From the 13th century onward, the traditional identity of the empire increasingly shifted away from the universal concept of the Romans toward a stronger emphasis on a distinct Greek identity. The dream of restoring universal Roman authority gradually gave way to the practical realities of survival. This new political outlook also influenced the Empire of Trebizond. Like the restored Byzantine Empire, the Komnenian rulers eventually recognized that they could no longer pursue an independent imperial policy while surrounded by stronger neighbors. Instead, diplomacy became their principal weapon. Alliances shifted constantly as emperors sought to balance the interests of the Ilkhanid Mongols, neighboring Turkish principalities, the Byzantine Empire, Georgia, and later, the rising maritime powers of the Mediterranean. Survival increasingly depended not on conquest, but on political flexibility. At the same time, the Seljuk Sultanate entered irreversible decline. Unable to withstand the growing pressure of the Mongol Empire, Seljuk authority steadily collapsed across Anatolia. Although the Ilkhanids replaced the Seljuks as the dominant regional power, they never succeeded in establishing firm and lasting control over every part of the peninsula. The resulting political vacuum encouraged fresh waves of Turkmen migration from Central Asia and northern Iran. These newcomers founded numerous frontier principalities that initially recognized either Seljuk or Mongol overlordship, but, in practice, governed themselves with considerable independence. When the Seljuk Sultanate finally disappeared at the beginning of the 14th century, these frontier emirates expanded even more rapidly. The political map of Anatolia fragmented into a mosaic of competing Turkish beyliks, each pursuing its own ambitions. Continuous warfare, shifting alliances, and the absence of a strong central authority transformed the military and political landscape. For the Empire of Trebizond, this marked the beginning of a new era. No longer confronted by a single powerful Seljuk state, it now faced a growing number of energetic Turkish principalities whose expansion would shape the future of the Eastern Black Sea for generations to come. During the 14th century, the international position of the Empire of Trebizond changed dramatically. As Ilkhanid authority weakened across Anatolia, new regional powers emerged to fill the political vacuum. Among them was the Eretna state, which established control over the important cities of Sivas and Kayseri. Trebizond was far too small to challenge the Turkmen rulers who now dominated central Anatolia. Yet, the changing balance of power also produced an unexpected result. The same Turkmen communities that had once threatened the empire's borders gradually became political partners, military allies, and even members of the Komnenian diplomatic network. By this time, Trebizond was surrounded by a collection of Turkish principalities rather than a single unified enemy. These included the Takedenids of Kanik, the Haçi Emiroğulları, the Akkoyunlu Turkmen, and the rulers of Bayburt, Erzincan, and Karahisar. Later in the century, Kadı Burhaneddin, ruling from Sivas, also became a major force in the region. Relations among these powers were constantly shifting. Their rivalries could threaten Trebizond, but they could also provide valuable opportunities. Whenever two neighboring beyliks went to war, the Komnenian emperors attempted to support the side most useful to their own survival. The conflict between Trebizond and its Turkmen neighbors unfolded along three principal frontier zones. The first stretched across the western coastline from Limnia to Giresun, linking a chain of vulnerable ports and fortresses. The second formed the empire's southern frontier, running through Trachomia, Chaldea, and the mountain routes, leading toward Bayburt. The third lay east of the capital and included Sürmeni, Rize, Gemora, and the province of Lazika. Of these three frontiers, the western coastline was the most exposed. The narrow strip between the Black Sea and the mountains offered little room for territorial expansion or organized defense. Beyond the coastal plain rose steep mountain ranges, while the inland valleys were increasingly controlled by Turkmen communities. By the beginning of the 14th century, imperial authority had largely disappeared from the interior. Trebizond retained only a thin coastal corridor, while almost the entire southern hinterland had passed into Turkish hands. The empire's western boundary extended only as far as the region around Akçabat, where a Greek-speaking rural population still survived in the surrounding countryside. Further west, important ports such as Limnia, Ünye, and the area around Cape Jason remained in constant danger. Trebizond lacked the military strength required to defend every isolated coastal settlement. As a result, the Komnenian rulers gradually accepted the loss of much of this territory rather than committing their limited forces to an unwinnable struggle. By 1404, Ünye was virtually the last important western possession still associated with the empire. The eastern frontier was considerably safer. The regions stretching through Sürmene, Rize, and Lazika were protected by geography and faced fewer organized Turkish attacks. The southern frontier, however, was a completely different matter. It included the mountain valleys and passes through which armies could descend toward Trabzon itself. Consequently, this zone became the main theater of war between the empire and the neighboring Turkmen beyliks. The 14th century struggle can broadly be divided into several phases. During the first half of the century, Turkish raids were directed mainly toward Trabzon and the strategically vital Matska Valley. These expeditions began in the early 1300s and continued with remarkable frequency until the middle of the century. Some were large military campaigns, while others were rapid raids designed to seize livestock, prisoners, and movable wealth. Yet even small expeditions could endanger the capital because the Muska Valley provided one of the most direct routes through the mountains. The Chronicle of Michael Panaretos preserves a valuable sequence of these attacks. In 1313, Emir Bayram led a campaign into the territory surrounding Trabzon. He returned in 1332, this time advancing into the Muska Valley. In 1336, forces commanded by Sheikh Hassan crossed the region near Mount Mithra. 4 years later, Turkmen, whom Panaretos identifies as the Amitiotai, probably connected with the Ak Koyunlu, attacked the empire. Further expeditions followed in 1341 and 1343, revealing how persistent the danger had become. The most serious attack of this early phase came in 1348, when Ahi Aina Bey and several allied Turkish rulers marched against Trabzon. Additional campaigns followed around 1351 or 1352, while imperial expeditions and reconnaissance journeys continued throughout the decade. In 1357, Haçlı Emir Ibrahim Bey advanced from the foothills of the Kanek Mountains toward Dikaisimon, the administrative center of the Muska Valley. Panaretos openly blamed this penetration on the empire's neglect of its own defenses. His criticism suggests that the attack succeeded not because Trebizond lacked soldiers altogether, but because its frontier system had become disorganized. Fortifications were poorly maintained, local commanders were unprepared, and the central government had been distracted by internal political struggles. Haçlı Emir was therefore able to reach unusually deep into imperial territory. Yet Trebizond was not completely helpless. When its rulers succeeded in concentrating their forces, they remained capable of defeating Turkish armies. This became clear during the campaign of Hoca Latif, whose troops entered the Muska region around 1360 or 1361. Imperial forces confronted the invaders and inflicted a significant defeat upon them. The victory demonstrated that the Komnenian state still possessed an effective army, even though it could not maintain permanent control over the entire frontier. After the middle of the century, the center of conflict gradually shifted away from the capital. Turkish raids were now increasingly directed toward Chaldea, Haryana, and the Kelkit Valley. This second phase lasted roughly from the 1350s into the 1370s. Instead of attempting to seize Trabzon directly, neighboring beys fought over mountain fortresses, rural districts, and the roads connecting the coast with central Anatolia. In 1355, imperial forces campaigned in the regions of Haryana and Sorogaina. Further operations followed in the same year, revealing the growing importance of the southern frontier. In 1360, Turkish troops under Hoca Latif entered Chaldea. The following year, Ahi Aina Bey attacked Golasha, another contested position in the interior. The emperor himself traveled through Chaldea in 1362 and again in 1367, probably to inspect fortresses, reinforce local loyalties, and demonstrate imperial authority in districts that were becoming increasingly difficult to control. The pressure continued. Kılıç Arslan campaigned in Chaldea in 1368, while Turkish forces attacked Golasha in 1369. Further incursions reached Haryana in 1373 and Golasha again in 1374. These repeated attacks reveal that the frontier remained unstable, but they did not produce a complete collapse of imperial defenses. The boundary moved gradually rather than suddenly, with villages, passes, and small fortresses changing hands while the main defensive line survived. The campaigns of Haçlı Emir and Hoca Latif marked the transition between the two phases. Haçlı Emir's advance toward Dikaisimon still directly threatened the capital, while Hoca Latif's later operations were increasingly connected with control of Chaldea and the southern mountain districts. After the 1350s, only a small number of Turkish expeditions reached the immediate surroundings of Trabzon. One ended in a clear imperial victory, while another caused serious damage despite the emperor's eventual success. Most of these Turkish campaigns were not designed to conquer the empire in a single decisive war. Their principal aims were usually plunder, political pressure, territorial testing, and the control of strategic mountain routes. Livestock, captives, agricultural goods, and toll revenues could all make a successful raid highly profitable. Turkish rulers also used such expeditions to display their strength before rival beys and to force Trebizond into diplomatic negotiations. Despite decades of warfare, the southern frontier did not change as dramatically as the frequency of the raids might suggest. Trebizond lost influence in the interior and faced almost constant pressure, but its core territory remained intact. Protected by steep mountains, fortified valleys, and access to the sea, the empire proved surprisingly difficult to destroy. The Komnenian rulers survived not by defeating every enemy, but by combining military resistance with diplomacy, tribute, marriage alliances, and carefully chosen partnerships. This was the defining character of Trebizond in the 14th century. It was no longer an expanding empire with realistic ambitions of recovering Constantinople. It had become a compact Black Sea state surrounded by dynamic Turkish principalities. Yet its apparent weakness concealed an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. The same rulers who raided its valleys in one decade might become its allies in the next. Through this delicate balance of conflict and cooperation, the Empire of Trebizond continued to survive in a region where far larger states had already disappeared. From the 1380s until the end of the 14th century, the southern frontier of the Empire of Trebizond entered a more stable phase. The relentless Turkmen raids that had dominated earlier decades gradually declined, and the immediate danger surrounding the empire began to ease. One major reason for this change was the rise of the Ak Koyunlu, whose growing influence introduced a degree of political order into the region. Although the frontier never became entirely peaceful, the constant cycle of attack and retaliation slowed considerably. Evidence from contemporary sources suggests that Trebizond's defenses had also improved. Writing about the 1330s, Andreas Libadenos described how the city walls were strengthened against attacks coming from the interior. In another work concerning the events of 1361, he contrasted earlier Byzantine defeats with the more successful resistance organized by the empire against Turkish forces. His writings were certainly intended to praise Emperor Alexios III, yet they still reveal an important shift. From around 1360 onward, Trebizond was following a more effective defensive policy. The victory over Hoca Latif, the emir of Bayburt, became a turning point in relations between Trebizond and its Turkish neighbors. The empire had shown that it could still protect its heartland and defeat an invading army when properly prepared. Records from the Vazalon monastery support this picture. Among nearly 200 surviving documents concerning communities in the Maska Valley, only a very small number mention inhabitants being captured by Turkish raiders. This does not mean the countryside was entirely safe, but it suggests that warfare was less destructive and less constant than the dramatic chronicles might imply. The geography of the region played a crucial role in both defense and trade. Deep valleys cut through the mountains of northeastern Anatolia, creating the only practical routes between the coast and the interior. Movement from one valley to another was extremely difficult. Travelers often had to descend toward the coast, follow the shoreline, and then enter the next valley before climbing inland again. Among these routes, the Matska Valley was especially important. Beginning south of Trabzon and following the Deir Mendera River into the mountains, it formed part of the principal road connecting Trabzon with Tabriz. Unlike many mountain passes, this route could remain active during both summer and winter. A caravan required roughly 32 days to travel between the two cities, carrying eastern luxury goods toward the Black Sea while returning with products from western markets. The same road that enriched Trebizond also exposed it to danger. Armies and raiding groups could use the Matska corridor to approach the capital, particularly during the campaigning season. Turkish forces would later follow this route during major operations in 1367 and again in 1461. For this reason, the emperors of Trebizond treated the defense of the valley as essential to the survival of their state. Monasteries, villages, fortifications, and military posts together formed a defensive landscape, protecting both the imperial capital and its most profitable commercial connection. While Trebizond strengthened its frontiers, the political world of central and eastern Anatolia was undergoing another transformation. The collapse of the Ilkhanid state was swift and unexpected. During the reign of its final powerful ruler, Abu Sa'id, central authority weakened dramatically, especially in the Anatolian provinces. Mongol governors and military commanders increasingly operated as independent rulers rather than loyal representatives of the Ilkhanid court. One of the most important figures in this period was Timurtash, son of the powerful Emir Chupan. Between 1321 and 1328, he governed Anatolia from Sivas, which served as the administrative center of the Mongol province of Rum. After Abu Sa'id died in 1335, rival aristocratic factions struggled for control of Tabriz. The Chupanids competed with the Jalayirids, while Ilkhanid authority became little more than a political fiction. Out of this confusion emerged Ala al-Din Eretna. Originally appointed as a provincial governor, Eretna gradually transformed his office into an independent state. When his superior departed for Tabriz, Eretna remained in Anatolia and consolidated control around Sivas and Kayseri. He initially shifted his loyalty between competing Mongol factions, but eventually recognized the authority of the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir before declaring effective independence around 1341. Eretna's position became secure after he defeated the forces of the Chupanid ruler Hasan Kuchak near Sivas in 1343. This victory allowed him to break his remaining ties with Tabriz and establish himself as an autonomous sovereign. His state expanded rapidly across central and northeastern Anatolia, absorbing strategically important cities and controlling many of the roads connecting Trebizond with the interior. Contemporary traveler Ibn Battuta reported that cities such as Sivas, Amasya, Sunusa, and Erzincan had already accepted Eretna's authority by the early 1330s. His expansion continued as Sivas, Amasya, Kema, Bayburt, Tokat, Karahisar, and Niksar entered his sphere of influence. Coins struck in Erzincan and Bayburt later confirmed that these territories remained connected with the Eretna dynasty. For the Empire of Trebizond, the rise of the Eretna state represented both an opportunity and a danger. On one hand, a relatively stable government in central Anatolia could restrain smaller Turkmen groups and protect commercial routes. On the other hand, Eretna's control of Bayburt, Erzincan, and other inland centers allowed his state to influence nearly every overland connection leading south from Trabzon. The Komnenian emperors therefore had to recognize this new power and adapt their diplomacy accordingly. Eretna died in the early 1350s, leaving behind a state that was stable in appearance but vulnerable beneath the surface. His successors lacked his authority, and dynastic disputes soon weakened the government. His son Mehmed inherited the throne, followed by his grandson Ala al-Din Ali. When Ali died from plague in 1380, the throne passed to his 7-year-old son. The child ruler's weakness encouraged leading officials to compete for power. Kulich Arslan, the emir of Karahisar, initially became regent, but he was soon killed by the ambitious statesman Kadir Burhaneddin. On February 9, 1381, Burhaneddin proclaimed himself ruler of Sivas, replacing the declining Eretna dynasty with a new regional state centered upon his own authority. The emergence of Kadir Burhaneddin added another powerful player to the political world surrounding Trebizond. His state controlled vital routes through Sivas and competed with the Turkmen principalities of northern Anatolia. From this point onward, Trebizond could no longer think of its relations with the Turks as a simple struggle between Christians and Muslims, or between a Greek empire and isolated raiders. The political environment had become far more complex. Turkish rulers fought one another as frequently as they fought Trebizond. A beylik that threatened the empire in one decade might seek its support against a rival in the next. The emperors responded by abandoning permanent loyalties and adopting a highly flexible diplomatic strategy. They negotiated with Eretna rulers, Turkmen emirs, Mongol governors, Georgian kings, and maritime powers according to the circumstances of the moment. By the end of the 14th century, the survival of Trebizond depended upon this ability to adapt. The empire could not dominate the interior, nor could it defeat every regional enemy. Yet it remained protected by its mountains, fortified valleys, maritime connections, and immense commercial value. As stronger states rose and collapsed around it, Trebizond learned to survive not through conquest, but by balancing its neighbors against one another and making itself too useful to destroy. After consolidating his authority, Kadir Burhaneddin devoted much of his reign to rebuilding the former territories of the Eretna state. His ambitions, however, met determined resistance. The rulers of Amasya, Niksar, Karahisar, Kayseri, and Erzincan had already begun asserting their independence during the final years of the Eretna dynasty, and were unwilling to accept a new master. As a result, central Anatolia became a battlefield where rival Turkish rulers competed for supremacy rather than a unified political landscape. The struggle soon expanded beyond the borders of Sivas. During the 1380s and the opening years of the 1390s, the rulers of Kastamonu, Sinop, Amasya, and Bafra formed alliances against Burhaneddin. At the same time, the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire entered the conflict. Sultan Murad I intervened in the affairs of both Kastamonu and Sivas, creating long-lasting tensions between the Ottomans and Burhaneddin. His successor, Bayezid I, continued this rivalry, and although temporary diplomatic settlements were eventually reached through Mamluk mediation, neither side abandoned its ambition to dominate northern Anatolia. Burhaneddin's remarkable career ended dramatically in 1398 when he was killed by the Ak Koyunlu ruler Osman Bey. His death immediately destabilized the region. Within a short time, the Ottomans moved decisively to exploit the resulting power vacuum. Bayezid I dispatched a large army under his son, the future Mehmed I, which successfully occupied Sivas with the assistance of part of the local population. The disappearance of Burhaneddin removed one of the last major obstacles preventing Ottoman expansion into central Anatolia. Yet another powerful challenger soon appeared. Following Burhaneddin's death, the rivalry between Bayezid I and the Central Asian conqueror Timur became the defining political struggle of the region. Timur temporarily captured and plundered Sivas in 1400, returning again in 1402 during his invasion of Anatolia. Although the city later returned to Ottoman control, Sivas retained its importance as the principal political center of northeastern Anatolia, and whoever controlled it exercised enormous influence over the neighboring frontier states. Among those frontier powers, the Emirate of Karahisar occupied a particularly strategic position. Centered on the important fortress of Kolonaya, modern Shebin Karahisar, the emirate controlled one of the richest alum mining districts in the Black Sea region. Established during the 1330s, it remained largely independent until the early 15th century and served as an important intermediary between central Anatolia and the Black Sea coast. Despite its significance, the history of this principality has received relatively little scholarly attention. The origins of the emirate were closely connected with the political turmoil that followed the collapse of Ilkhanid authority. Historical records indicate that Hasan Küçük, the powerful Chobanid ruler, reached Anatolia around 1330 to 1331 before establishing himself at Karahisar. Even after seizing Tabriz and becoming one of the dominant figures of the region, he never neglected his Anatolian base. The state treasury remained at Karahisar, important prisoners were confined there, and the fortress continued serving as one of the principal centers of Chobanid authority. Relations between the Chobanids and the Empire of Trebizond were not always peaceful. According to Michael Panaretos, Hasan Küçük launched a campaign against Trabzon in 1336, advancing as far as Mount Mithra near the imperial frontier. Nature, however, intervened before battle could decide the outcome. Torrential rain devastated the mountain roads, preventing the army from continuing its advance. During the expedition, one of Hasan's commanders, Abdurrahim, lost his life. Although contemporary sources offer little explanation for the motives behind the campaign, the episode illustrates how geography could become as formidable an obstacle as any defending army. Following Hasan Küçük's death, his brother Malik Ashraf largely abandoned the family's earlier interest in the Black Sea frontier. Instead of continuing campaigns toward Trabzon, he concentrated on consolidating his own authority elsewhere. Even so, Chobanid influence remained visible across northeastern Anatolia. Contemporary evidence indicates that the dynasty controlled much of the region around Erzurum. while place names, medieval fortifications, and even the observations of Evliya Çelebi centuries later preserved memories of their presence throughout the eastern Black Sea mountains. By the middle of the century, political authority over Karahisar shifted once again. Between 1347 and 1357, the emirate returned to the sphere of Sivas, and by 1362 its fortresses acknowledged the authority of Emir Pir Hüseyin of Erzincan. Soon afterward, the region came under the control of Kılıç Arslan, one of the most active frontier rulers of the late 14th century. Panaretos records that Kılıç Arslan invaded the province of Chaldea in 1368. Additional campaigns against Chaldea, Cheriana, and neighboring districts followed in 1369, 1373, and 1374. These expeditions appear to have been motivated primarily by the search for plunder and the desire to reward Turkmen followers, rather than by attempts to annex the Empire of Trebizond permanently. Raiding remained one of the principal economic and political instruments available to frontier emirs. The Komnenian emperors did not simply remain on the defensive. In 1370, Emperor Alexios III personally led an expedition against the Turks of Karahisar, demonstrating that Trebizond could still project military power beyond its immediate borders. Diplomatic competition also intensified. As negotiations developed between the empire and Tatseddin Bey, Kılıç Arslan reportedly prepared another offensive against Trabzon in 1379, hoping to prevent any alliance that might strengthen his rivals. Having learned of the plan in advance, the emperor reinforced the city's fortifications and strengthened the surrounding defenses, successfully preparing the capital against a possible assault. By the closing decades of the 14th century, the political environment surrounding the Empire of Trebizond had become extraordinarily complex. The decline of the Eretna dynasty, the rise of Kadı Burhanedin, the growing ambitions of the Ottomans, the arrival of Timur, and the constant rivalry among Turkish frontier lords produced a rapidly changing balance of power. For Trebizond, survival depended less upon defeating its neighbors than upon carefully navigating these rivalries. One year, a neighboring emir might threaten the empire's frontiers. The next, he might become a valuable ally against an even greater danger. This ability to adapt remained the greatest strength of the Komnenian state during its final centuries. Following the death of Kılıç Arslan during the winter of 1380 to 1381, authority in the emirate of Karahisar passed to Emir Melik Ahmed. From the beginning of his rule until the closing years of the 14th century, Melik Ahmed maintained close political ties with Muta Hatun, the powerful ruler of Erzincan, and continued to recognize him as his overlord. Their alliance became especially important as the threat posed by Timur grew steadily across eastern Anatolia. Fearing the approaching conqueror, Muta Hatun even transferred members of his own family to Karahisar in 1395, treating the fortress as one of the safest strongholds under his influence. The same year witnessed another dramatic shift in regional politics. Kadı Burhanedin marched against Bayburt and during his return campaign passed through Karahisar. Faced with overwhelming military pressure, Melik Ahmed temporarily accepted Burhanedin's authority. This submission proved short-lived. Later, in 1395, Burhanedin suffered a serious defeat at Pulur near Bayburt during a battle against Muta Hatun. Learning of his patron's success, Melik Ahmed attempted to attack the retreating Sivas army but failed to achieve a decisive victory. Despite repeated campaigns, Burhanedin never succeeded in bringing Karahisar permanently under his control. Although surviving sources say almost nothing about direct relations between Melik Ahmed and the Empire of Trebizond, one important fact is beyond doubt. Muta Hatun, Melik Ahmed's principal ally, maintained friendly relations with the Komnenian emperors. Consequently, Karahisar stood within the wider political network that linked Trebizond with the rulers of Erzincan against common regional rivals. The later history of Karahisar remains only partially documented. Shortly after 1410, the Karakoyunlu commander Pir Ömer Bey besieged the city. Although Ottoman assistance briefly enabled Melik Ahmed's administration to survive, Pir Ömer eventually captured the fortress. By 1422, Karahisar had become part of the expanding Akkoyunlu state under Yakub ibn Osman, remaining in Akkoyunlu hands until the late 1450s. Even when local revolts broke out against Uzun Hasan, the district remained firmly within the political world of the Turkmen confederations. These developments illustrate how completely the southern frontier of Trebizond had passed into Turkish control by the 15th century. Further east, the political history of Erzincan followed a similarly complex path. During the early 13th century, the Empire of Trebizond briefly extended its influence as far as the Erzincan-Erzurum corridor by bringing local rulers into its sphere. That period proved short-lived. Following the Seljuk campaign against Trabzon, and especially after the Battle of Kosa Dağ, the balance of power shifted decisively. Erzincan eventually came under Mongol authority before passing into the hands of successive regional emirs. By 1331, both Erzincan and Bayburt recognized the authority of Eretna, the Mongol governor who later founded his own independent state. Yet the political fragmentation following the decline of Mongol power soon weakened Eretna's control. During the 1340s, new local rulers emerged. According to Michael Panaretos, Ahi Aina Bey governed Erzincan by 1348, while Bayburt was controlled by a ruler identified as Mehmed Rekabdar. Beyond their joint expedition against Trabzon, however, the surviving sources reveal little about relations between these neighboring emirs. Relations among these rulers were far from peaceful. Around 1360 to 1361, Hoka Latif controlled Bayburt, while Ahi Aina Bey ruled Erzincan. Armenian and Islamic sources suggest that Hoka Latif even launched attacks against Ahi Aina Bey before both leaders independently turned their attention toward the Empire of Trebizond. Their rivalry therefore coexisted with occasional cooperation whenever campaigns against the Black Sea frontier offered opportunities for plunder or political advantage. The first major campaign led by Ahi Aina Bey against Trebizond took place in 1348. More than a decade later, in 1361, he returned and besieged the fortresses of Golasha and Kokos. Panaretos records that the siege continued for more than 2 weeks and that sophisticated siege engines were employed, demonstrating that these operations were considerably more ambitious than ordinary frontier raids. Although the campaign ultimately failed, it revealed the increasing military capabilities of the Turkish frontier emirates. Islamic geographical terminology of the period also provides an interesting insight into the conflict. Contemporary Muslim writers frequently referred to the eastern territories of the Empire of Trebizond simply as Lazika or the land of the Laz. Consequently, references to campaigns against Laz territories often indicate operations directed against the empire itself, rather than against an independent Laz population. The terminology reflects how neighboring Muslim states viewed the political geography of the eastern Black Sea. Concern over this frontier is reflected in the actions of Emperor Alexios III, who personally inspected Lazika on 3 separate occasions. His first major visit, undertaken in 1367 with both army and fleet, demonstrates that the eastern provinces continued to demand close imperial attention even after Ahi Aina Bey's death. The persistence of these inspections suggests that the Turkish threat had by no means disappeared. Hoka Latif proved to be one of the empire's most determined enemies. During his first campaign in 1360, he successfully prevented the construction of the strategically important Kukos fortress, which was intended to guard the route connecting Bayburt with the interior of Chaldea. Recognizing the fortress's importance, Hoka Latif attempted to eliminate the project before it could strengthen Trebizond's defenses. His second expedition, launched through the Maska Valley in 1361, ended very differently. Imperial forces defeated the invading army, captured Hoka Latif, and executed him shortly afterward. His severed head was displayed publicly in Trabzon as a symbol of imperial victory. The triumph demonstrated that, although Trebizond could rarely eliminate the frontier emirates permanently, it remained fully capable of defeating even experienced Turkish commanders when fighting on favorable terrain. The frontier remained unstable despite these successes. Throughout the 1350s and 1360s, Turkish forces repeatedly attacked Haryana, southern Chaldea, and neighboring districts. Several fortresses changed hands, including Soragina, while imperial commanders occasionally suffered serious defeats and even captivity. Modern historians continue to debate which Turkmen groups participated in these operations. Some attribute them to Chepni tribes, while others associate them more closely with the campaigns of Ahi Aina Bey or neighboring frontier rulers. The surviving evidence does not permit a definitive conclusion, illustrating how fragmented political authority had become across northeastern Anatolia. Ahi Aina Bey himself appears to have died during military operations in 1362. Shortly afterward, authority in Erzincan passed to Pir Hüseyin, who rapidly established control over both Erzincan and Bayburt after defeating several rival emirs. Although little is known about his origins, the sequence of events has led some historians to speculate that he may have been Ahi Aina Bey's son or close relative. His rise once again demonstrates how frequently power changed hands among the Turkish frontier states. During this same period, Emperor Alexios III personally traveled into Chaldea, almost certainly because the political upheaval around Erzincan and Bayburt directly affected Trebizond's vital commercial routes to the interior. Control of these mountain corridors determined not only military security, but also the prosperity of the empire's trade with eastern Anatolia and beyond. Following Pir Hüseyin's death in 1379, the ambitious ruler Mutahattin seized control of Erzincan. Closely connected with the former Eretna dynasty, he quickly emerged as one of the most influential figures in northeastern Anatolia. Bayburt also entered his sphere of authority soon afterward. Under Mutahattin, Erzincan became a powerful regional state whose diplomacy and military campaigns would shape the balance of power surrounding the Empire of Trebizond during the final decades of the 14th century. During the final decades of the 14th century, the struggle between Emir Mutahattin of Erzincan and Kader Burhaneddin of Sivas became one of the defining conflicts of northeastern Anatolia. Control of the chain of strategic fortresses stretching from Koyulhisar toward Erzincan lay at the heart of their rivalry. Mutahattin controlled strongholds such as Akşehir, Sis, Ezbider, and Bertuluş, while the lands farther north remained under the authority of his vassal, Melik Ahmed of Karahisar. In the spring of 1382, Mutahattin launched an ambitious campaign to seize Koyulhisar, but despite repeated assaults and continued pressure on the defenders, the fortress held firm. His failure marked the beginning of a prolonged military deadlock rather than a decisive victory for either side. The conflict continued throughout the decade. Although Mutahattin repeatedly raided the territory surrounding Sivas, he failed to secure lasting gains. Burhaneddin answered with his own offensives, gradually regaining the initiative. In 1389, an agreement between the two rivals resulted in the destruction of the fortress of Bertuluş, yet peace remained elusive. Fighting soon resumed, and by the mid-1390s, Burhaneddin's armies had overrun several of Mutahattin's fortresses, devastated the regions around Koyulhisar and Karahisar, and pushed deep toward Bayburt. Even though Mutahattin managed to defeat Burhaneddin near Pulor in 1395, the balance of power remained uncertain until Burhaneddin's death. Mutahattin did not face Sivas alone. He cultivated a network of alliances with neighboring rulers, particularly the emirs of Amasya and Niksar. In 1381, he concluded an agreement with Haçlı Şadgeldi, ruler of Amasya, while Taçeddin, the emir of Niksar, also joined the anti-Sivas coalition. These alliances briefly strengthened Mutahattin's position, but circumstances soon changed. The fall of Amasya to Bayezid I and the weakening of the Taçeddinoğulları left Mutahattin carrying almost the entire burden of resisting Sivas on his own. At the same time, the Empire of Trebizond found itself in an increasingly delicate position. From 1379 onward, the Emirate of Erzincan became the only major state sharing a continuous frontier with the empire. Mutahattin ruled not only Erzincan but also Bayburt and Ispir, while his vassal controlled Karahisar, effectively surrounding Trebizond's southern frontier. As Turkish principalities expanded across the interior, the empire's traditional overland connections with Anatolia became dependent on the goodwill of these neighboring rulers. In response, the Komnenian dynasty strengthened its alliance with Mutahatun, sealing the relationship through a dynastic marriage in which a Trebizond princess became the emir's wife. This partnership was not merely ceremonial, it became essential for the empire's survival. The remarkably peaceful frontier during the 1380s and 1390s reflects the success of this alliance. Unlike earlier decades, the Chronicle of Michael Panaretos records virtually no major clashes between Turkish forces and the Empire of Trebizond after Alexios III's campaign against the Chepni in 1380. Trade continued to flow through Trabzon despite the political instability surrounding it, suggesting that diplomatic cooperation had largely replaced military confrontation. Several contemporary writers even imply that Trebizond paid tribute to Mutahatun in exchange for protection and secure commercial access to the Anatolian interior. Whether these payments represented formal submission or simply the price of maintaining peace remains debated, but they clearly formed part of a pragmatic political arrangement that benefited both sides. The regional balance shifted dramatically after 1398, when Bayezid I absorbed Sivas into the Ottoman state and immediately turned his attention toward Erzincan. Refusing to submit without resistance, Mutahatun appealed to Timur, whose growing influence now overshadowed eastern Anatolia. Diplomatic efforts failed, and the dispute escalated into a confrontation between two of the greatest rulers of the age. Timur marched westward, captured Sivas in 1400, and forced Bayezid to respond. Ottoman forces entered Erzincan and briefly captured Mutahatun, but the city was eventually restored to him after local opposition made direct Ottoman rule impractical. For a short time, Mutahatun even acted as a mediator between Timur and Bayezid before joining Timur's famous Anatolian campaign in 1402. Mutahatun's death in 1403 marked the end of Erzincan's brief period as a dominant regional power. His successors struggled to preserve their independence as the city became the object of rivalry between the Ak Koyunlu and Kara Koyunlu. Confederations. Pir Ömer, appointed by Kara Yusuf, initially established himself as ruler of Erzincan and expanded his authority over Bayburt, Turkan, and Ispir. Yet his ambitions ultimately proved fatal. Seeking to enlarge his power, he confronted Osman Bey of the Ak Koyunlu, suffered defeat, and was eventually executed after refusing to surrender Erzincan. The city subsequently became a prize contested between the rival Turkmen confederations, ending the independent political role that Mutahatun had built over the previous 2 decades. Following the death of Kara Yusuf, the political situation in Erzincan changed once again. The city's leading nobles expelled his grandson, the descendant of the prince Abu Sa'id, whom Kara Yusuf had previously sent to govern Erzincan, and replaced him with Yar Ali, a grandson of Emir Mutahatun. This transition restored Mutahatun's family to power and ensured that Erzincan remained closely connected to the Ak Koyunlu sphere until roughly the middle of the 15th century. As the struggle between the Ak Koyunlu and Kara Koyunlu intensified, Erzincan became one of the most strategically valuable cities in eastern Anatolia. The alliance between the Empire of Trebizond and the Aku Koyunlu also grew stronger during this period. When Osman Bey advanced into the Erzincan region, after defeating the Kara Koyunlu, the Emperor of Trebizond personally visited his military camp. Rather than remaining a passive observer, the empire actively contributed to Osman Bey's campaign by supplying siege equipment, including trebuchets, stone-throwing engines, and other heavy military machines. This cooperation reflected the increasingly close political relationship between the Komnenian dynasty and the Ak Koyunlu rulers. A few decades later, during the late 1450s, Uzun Hasan finally captured Erzincan from Jahan Shah, bringing the city firmly under Ak Koyunlu control and further strengthening the alliance that would dominate the eastern Black Sea during the empire's final years. The Khanate Beylik and the Empire of Trebizond. Just as Western Anatolia witnessed the emergence of frontier Turkish principalities fighting against Byzantium after the decline of the Seljuk Sultanate, the Black Sea coast experienced a similar transformation. Along the southern shores of the Black Sea, a series of independent Turkish beyliks arose, challenging the authority of the Empire of Trebizond while filling the political vacuum left by the collapse of centralized Seljuk rule. Among the most influential of these frontier states was the Khanate Beylik, ruled by the Tatsedinoğulları dynasty. The origins of the dynasty remain obscure. Contemporary sources preserve almost no reliable information concerning the ancestry of Emir Tatsedin, who is generally regarded as the founder of the principality. Before his rise, however, the region around Niksar had already been dominated by another local ruler known as Emir Doğançık. He controlled the lands west of Trebizond and periodically launched expeditions toward the empire's frontier. Although little is known about his life, later traditions suggest that Tatsedin inherited both his territories and his political position after Doğançık's death. During the early years of his rule, Tatsedin remained subordinate to Haçlı Şadgeldi, the powerful ruler of Amasya, reflecting the fragmented political structure that characterized northern Anatolia in the late 14th century. The balance of power shifted dramatically in 1381 when Haçlı Şadgeldi was ambushed and killed by Kadir Burhaneddin. His death forced Tatsedin to acknowledge the authority of the rulers of Sivas, supplying troops and tribute to the successor state that had emerged from the former Eretna realm. Across Anatolia, political authority was divided among numerous regional powers. Murad I ruled the Ottoman state, Bayezid governed Kastamonu, Melik Ahmed controlled Karahisar, and Muta Hatun dominated Erzincan. In this competitive political environment, every frontier ruler had to navigate shifting alliances in order to survive. Evidence suggests that the early expansion of the Khanate Beylik coincided with the gradual loss of imperial territory along the western Black Sea coast. The capture of Ünye in 1347 was probably connected with the first generation of Tatsedin's followers. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios III repeatedly inspected and reinforced the defenses of Limnia between 1351 and 1369, recognizing that the western frontier faced growing pressure from Turkmen tribes moving steadily toward the coast. These inspections reveal that the empire regarded Tatsedin's expanding principality as one of its most serious strategic concerns. During the 1370s, relations between Tatsedin and the rulers of Sivas deteriorated further. When he stopped sending tribute and military assistance to the Eretna government, Ala al-Din Ali Bey and Kadir Burhaneddin launched a punitive expedition against Niksar in the spring of 1379. Although the invaders devastated parts of the countryside, the campaign failed to achieve its principal objective because of poor leadership and inadequate coordination. Rather than restoring Sivas's authority, the expedition encouraged Tatsedin to pursue an increasingly independent policy. From this point onward, the Khanate Beylik effectively functioned as an autonomous regional state. Freed from external control, Tatsedin rapidly expanded his authority. His influence eventually stretched across Niksar, Amasya, Samsun, Ordu, the western districts of Giresun, the southern approaches to Trabzon, and the region of Iskefzer. Every winter, his Turkmen forces descended from the mountains into the fertile coastal plains, conducting raids that supplied wealth, livestock, and political prestige. These seasonal expeditions reflected the traditional military practices of frontier Turkmen society, while simultaneously extending Tatsedin's influence across the eastern Black Sea. Yet military conflict was only one aspect of Tatsedin's relationship with Trebizond. Diplomatic marriage became an equally important instrument of frontier politics. Around 1362, Tatsedin strengthened relations with the Komnenian dynasty by marrying a princess of Trebizond. Later, in 1379, as the growing threat posed by Kılıç Arslan endangered the regional balance, Emperor Alexios III offered his daughter Eudokia in marriage to Tatsedin. The alliance fundamentally altered relations between the two states. Once linked through family ties, Tatsedin was no longer viewed as a direct existential threat to Trebizond. Instead, both sides shared an interest in preserving stability along their common frontier and counterbalancing rival Turkish rulers. The agreement also strengthened imperial influence around Limnia, while certain frontier districts were granted to the Khanate Turks as part of the wider political settlement. Tatsedin's career came to an end in October 1386, when he was killed during a conflict with Haçlı Emir. Following his death, Kadir Burhaneddin moved quickly to recover important fortresses, including Niksar and Iskefser, from the weakened Khanate Beylik. Nevertheless, Tacheddin's diplomatic legacy endured. He had maintained close relations not only with the rulers of Amasya, but also with Mutahattin of Erzincan, creating a network of alliances that indirectly protected the Empire of Trebizond. Through carefully arranged marriages and shared political interests, the Komnenian emperors transformed former enemies into valuable partners, allowing the empire to survive despite the growing dominance of Turkish principalities throughout northern Anatolia. During the 1390s, the Khanate Beylik found itself caught in the struggle for dominance between Kadir Burhaneddin and the other Turkish rulers of northern Anatolia. The sons of Emir Tacheddin repeatedly joined anti-Sivas coalitions that also included the rulers of Kastamonu, Bafra, the Taşanağulları, and even the expanding Ottoman Empire. Burhaneddin answered these alliances with a determined military campaign. Between 1392 and 1393, he occupied the strategically important Fanaroya Valley, forcing the Khanate forces to retreat north of Niksar into the rugged mountains west of the Yeşilırmak River. Although he invaded the Khanate Mountains again in 1394, Burhaneddin still failed to establish permanent authority over the region or secure complete control of the vital corridor leading to the Black Sea. The later history of the Khanate Beylik appears only sporadically in the surviving sources. During the 1410s, Emir Hasan ibn Alp Arslan, a grandson of Tacheddin, killed Emir Chunayd of the Kubadoğulları and temporarily regained control of Khanate. His success, however, proved short-lived. In 1427 to 1428, the Ottomans finally annexed the Beylik. Emir Hasan surrendered to the Ottoman commander Yarguç Pasha and was taken to Bursa as a prisoner. Although he briefly escaped captivity, he later surrendered voluntarily to Sultan Murad II, who rewarded him with lands in Rumelia, effectively ending the political independence of the Taçedinoğulları, the Hacıemiroğulları, and the Empire of Trebizond. East of the Khanate Beylik lay another powerful frontier state, the Hacıemiroğulları. Although Michael Panaretos never explicitly identifies the Turkish forces that occupied Chaldea during the late 13th century, many historians believe they belonged to the armies of Hacı Emir. Unlike the neighboring rulers of Amasya, Karahisar, or Erzincan, there is no clear evidence that the Hacıemiroğulları achieved complete independence from Sivas before 1386. Nevertheless, they emerged as one of the most active Turkish powers, confronting the Empire of Trebizond throughout the 14th century. The founder of the dynasty, Bayram Bey, appears repeatedly in the imperial chronicles. In 1313, he captured the fortified site known as Chergay, probably located near Trabzon or somewhere within the Matska Valley. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1332, Panaretos records that Bayram's followers advanced as far as Asomatos, another important position inside the valley. These expeditions demonstrate that the Hacıemiroğulları posed a direct threat to the heart of the empire long before they established a fully independent principality. Military confrontation continued during the reign of Alexios III Komnenos. In January 1357, imperial forces killed 14 Turkish warriors near Cape Jason, probably members of Hacı Emir's following. Later that same year, Hacı Emir launched one of the most serious attacks of the century, advancing as far as Dikaysimyon in the Matska Valley. The following year, however, relations changed dramatically. In August 1358, the emperor offered his sister Theodora in marriage to Hacı Emir, and only a few months later, Alexios personally visited the emir's military camp. The marriage transformed a dangerous frontier enemy into an important political ally, illustrating once again the Komnenian preference for diplomacy whenever military victory alone could not secure the frontier. The alliance did not eliminate regional rivalries. By 1386, conflict between Hacı Emir and Taçeddin Bey had intensified. Instead of expanding his own territories, Hacı Emir was forced to recognize the authority of Kadir Burhaneddin, who granted the important fortress of Iskefser to Hacı Emir's son Süleyman Bey as a hereditary fief. Contemporary evidence suggests that hostility between Taçeddin and Hacı Emir had begun many years earlier. Their rivalry complicated Trebizond's own diplomatic strategy because the empire had already established family ties with Tatedin through dynastic marriage. Balancing relations with both Turkish rulers required considerable political skill. Following 1386, relations between Suleiman Bey and the Empire of Trebizond deteriorated sharply. Between 1396 and 1397, he assembled an army reportedly numbering 12,000 men and succeeded in recovering Giresun. At the same time, he formally acknowledged the authority of Kadı Burhaneddin, extending Sivas's influence toward the Black Sea. Contemporary sources identify Gökasak, located somewhere between Cape Jason and Giresun, as the northernmost coastal point connected with Burhaneddin's sphere of influence. Even so, he never established permanent control over additional Black Sea ports, leaving Trebizond's maritime communications largely intact. The situation changed again around the turn of the century. Sometime between 1398 and 1402, Giresun returned to the authority of the Empire of Trebizond without direct Ottoman intervention. Meanwhile, during Timur's invasion of Anatolia, the Hatyemiroğulları acknowledged the conqueror's supremacy. When the Castilian ambassador, Ruy González de Clavijo, passed through the region in 1404, he described a Turkish ruler named Arzemir, generally identified with Haçlı Emir, who commanded approximately 10,000 cavalry and even collected tribute from the Empire of Trebizond. His account represents the final clear reference to the Hatyemiroğulları in contemporary historical sources. The exact extent of the Hatyemiroğulları territory remains debated. Some historians argue that their lands stretched farther east than previously believed, while others place their frontier closer to Ordu and Giresun. Geographic evidence suggests that the principality occupied much of the region between these two cities, threatening Giresun, Cape Jason, the Matska Valley, and the northwestern approaches to Trabzon. Because of this strategic position, imperial campaigns against the Hatyemiroğulları usually focused on the same frontier districts. One of the most debated locations is Hospitokastron, whose exact identification remains uncertain. Regardless of its precise location, the fortress almost certainly stood somewhere between Giresun and Karahisar, directly along the principal military route leading toward the Empire of Trebizond. The later history of the Beylik is difficult to reconstruct. During the 1450s, the alliance between Uzun Hasan and the Empire of Trebizond against the Ottomans suggests that the lands once ruled by the Hatyemiroğulları no longer existed as an independent political entity. By then, Ottoman authority extended as far as Koyulhisar, while the frontier followed the Melet River. Ottoman settlement records compiled after the conquest of Trabzon in 1461 also indicate that former Khanate territories had already been integrated into the Ottoman administrative system decades earlier. These developments strongly suggest that the Hatyemiroğulları had disappeared as an independent power sometime after 1404, with their remaining lands eventually absorbed either by the Empire of Trebizond or, more likely, by the expanding Ottoman state. We examine the earliest history of the Akkoyunlu Confederation through the unique testimony of Michael Panaretos, whose chronicle preserves some of the oldest surviving references to the dynasty. While most Eastern sources do not mention the Akkoyunlu until 1379, Panaretos records their activities nearly 40 years earlier, describing their first known attack on the Empire of Trebizond in 1340. His account therefore provides an exceptionally valuable glimpse into the formative years of a power that would later dominate Eastern Anatolia. Additional clues about the Akkoyunlu's early origins appear in the travel account of Ibn Battuta, who visited Erzurum during the early 14th century. He observed that the city had fallen into ruin because of constant warfare between two rival Turkmen confederations. Later, historians identified these groups as the Akkoyunlu and the Karakoyunlu, suggesting that both were already active in eastern Anatolia decades before they emerged prominently in written sources. The Akkoyunlu were closely associated with the Bayındır branch of the Oghuz Turks, whose tribal name gradually became synonymous with the confederation itself. Although Bayındır place names are found across western Anatolia, there is no convincing evidence that the Akkoyunlu originally migrated westward before returning east. Instead, They seem to have established themselves in the Bayburt-Erzincan region during the first half of the 14th century. Panaretos refers to the Ak-Koyunlu as the Amitiotai, a name that has generated considerable scholarly debate. Some historians have linked the term to Amid, Diyarbakir, while others argue that it derives from Omidia, a district west of Giresun. Whatever the precise origin of the name, Panaretos clearly associates this Turkmen confederation with the northeastern frontier of Anatolia rather than with the later Ak-Koyunlu capital in Diyarbakir. Archaeological evidence also supports the presence of Tur Ali Bey, one of the earliest known Ak-Koyunlu leaders, in the Bayburt and Erzincan region during the 1340s, confirming that the confederation had already become an important regional force. The rise of the Aku-Koyunlu coincided with one of the darkest periods in the history of the Empire of Trebizond. Between approximately 1330 and 1355, the empire was torn apart by a devastating civil war that divided the imperial court and the great aristocratic families. Powerful noble houses, including the Scholarioi, Kabazitai, Mesomatai, Doranitai, and Kamechenoi, formed shifting alliances, rebelled against imperial authority, and fought one another in a prolonged struggle for political dominance. During this chaotic period, no fewer than 6 emperors occupied the throne in rapid succession, while alliances changed almost as quickly as the balance of power itself. The conflict reflected not merely disputes within the imperial family, but also the determination of provincial magnates to strengthen their own regional influence at the expense of the central government. Virtually everything known about this civil war comes from the chronicle of Michael Panaretos, who was both a contemporary witness and a senior imperial official. Serving as protonotarios, he observed many of these events firsthand, making his narrative one of the most reliable sources for 14th century Trebizond. His perspective naturally reflects the official position of the imperial court, yet it also provides invaluable evidence for understanding how the empire confronted both internal rebellion and external threats simultaneously. Against this backdrop, the Ak-Koyunlu emerged as an increasingly influential military power. Panaretos records 5 separate clashes between the empire and the Amitiotai, leading many historians to conclude that various factions within Trebizond attempted to recruit Turkmen support during the civil war, although the chronicler never explicitly states that the Ak-Koyunlu intervened in the conflict itself. The pattern of repeated military expeditions strongly suggests that rival aristocratic families sought outside allies to strengthen their position. Since the Aku-Koyunlu were already settled only a few days' march from Trebizond, in the Erzincan Bayburt region, they represented a readily available source of experienced mounted warriors capable of influencing the balance of power. Panaretos records Aku-Koyunlu campaigns against the empire in August 1340, July 1341, August 1341, June 1343, and June 1348. Although these expeditions caused considerable destruction, they did not fundamentally alter the outcome of the imperial civil war. Instead, their greatest political consequence came through diplomacy rather than conquest. Recognizing that continued conflict benefited neither side, Emperor Alexios III sought peace by arranging a dynastic marriage. In the summer of 1352, his daughter Maria Komnene married Kutlu Bey, the son of Tur Ali Bey, establishing the first formal alliance between the Empire of Trebizond and the Aku-Koyunlu Confederation. This marriage transformed a dangerous frontier rival into an important political partner and laid the foundations for the remarkably close relationship that would later flourish during the reign of Uzun Hasan. The history of the Empire of Trebizond cannot be understood simply as the story of a small, Byzantine successor state struggling to survive on the Black Sea coast. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, the empire stood at the center of a rapidly changing political landscape shaped by the collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate, the expansion of the Mongol Empire, the rise of powerful Turkmen principalities, and the emergence of new regional powers such as the Eretna state, Kadıburhanedin, the Ak-Koyunlu, and the Ottomans. Rather than relying solely on military strength, the Komnenian emperors developed a remarkably flexible foreign policy. Whenever possible, they avoided prolonged warfare and instead sought to preserve their independence through diplomacy, dynastic marriages, commercial cooperation, and carefully balanced alliances. Former enemies frequently became allies, while alliances shifted as the political balance of Anatolia changed. This pragmatic approach enabled Trebizond to survive despite being surrounded by stronger and more populous states. The frontier between Trebizond and the Turkmen principalities was therefore not a rigid military border, but a dynamic political zone where conflict, trade, diplomacy, and cultural interaction coexisted. Raids and military campaigns certainly remained a constant feature of frontier life, yet they were accompanied by periods of cooperation, commercial exchange, and political partnership. Marriages between the Komnenian dynasty and leading Turkmen families, including the rulers of the Khanate Beylik, the Hachemiroğulları, and especially the Ak Koyunlu, demonstrate that political necessity often outweighed religious or cultural divisions. Trade remained the foundation of Trebizond's prosperity. Its strategic position on the Black Sea connected the Mediterranean world with eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, Iran, and Central Asia. As long as these commercial routes remained open, every major regional power, from the Ilkhanids to the Ak Koyunlu, had a strong interest in maintaining relations with the empire. This economic importance explains why Trebizond continued to play a significant diplomatic role long after its military resources had become relatively limited. The emergence of the Ak Koyunlu marked a decisive turning point in the empire's later history. What began as a frontier Turkmen confederation gradually evolved into Trebizond's most valuable ally. The marriage alliance established during the reign of Alexios III laid the foundation for a relationship that reached its height under Uzun Hasan, when the Ak Koyunlu became the principal counterweight to Ottoman expansion in eastern Anatolia. At the same time, the political fragmentation of Anatolia created both opportunities and dangers. Rivalries among the Khanate Beylik, the Hachemiroğulları, Karahisar, Erzincan, the Eretna rulers, Kadıburhanedin, the Ak Koyunlu, and the Kara Koyunlu constantly reshaped the balance of power. The emperors of Trebizond successfully exploited these rivalries for more than 2 centuries, preventing any single neighboring power from dominating the eastern Black Sea region. Ultimately, however, this diplomatic strategy depended upon the continued existence of multiple competing states. As the Ottoman Empire absorbed the independent Turkish beyliks and expanded across Anatolia during the 15th century, the political environment that had sustained Trebizond gradually disappeared. The disappearance of regional buffer states left the empire increasingly isolated. Although Trebizond continued to benefit from its commercial wealth, strong fortifications, and strategic alliances, it could no longer rely on the balance of power that had protected it for generations. The history of Trebizond during the 13th and 14th centuries therefore illustrates far more than the survival of a Byzantine successor state. It reveals a frontier society where diplomacy proved as important as warfare, where trade shaped political decisions as much as military campaigns, and where Byzantine, Turkic, Mongol, Armenian, Georgian, and Islamic political traditions interacted continuously. This complex network of alliances, rivalries, and economic interests enabled the Empire of Trebizond to preserve its independence for over 2.5 centuries, making it one of the longest-lasting and most resilient states to emerge from the fragmentation of the Byzantine world.